Think back to when you were a kid. One of the absolute best things about being young was going to a sleepover at your best friend's house. For me, that friend was a boy named Joe. Joe had this amazing house. It was huge, but the best part about it was the basement. It was fully finished with a pool table, air hockey, and a giant looping layout. Joe and I would spend hours down there riding our scooters in circles on the smooth floor. We would get these massive sugar rushes from eating junk food and playing video games late into the night. And the best part of all was that Joe's parents slept all the way upstairs. They could never hear us. We could make as much noise as we wanted, and we felt like we owned the place. I will never forget the night my mom dropped me off at Joe's house. It was right before a major holiday, which meant we did not have any school the next day. We had the entire night to ourselves. After dinner, we went straight down to the basement. Joe had just gotten a new game for his PlayStation, and we were completely locked in, staring at the screen. And then, right in the middle of our game, the door to the laundry room in the back creaked open. Joe paused the game. We both turned around to look. The door was now cracked open just a little bit, revealing a sliver of pitch-black space inside. I felt a chill run down my spine. I told Joe he should go check it out. He shook his head and said it was fine, that the door did that sometimes on its own. But to be honest, even though we loved the basement, being down there alone at night could get pretty spooky. And so, I told him to just go shut the door anyway. Having that door open, looking into a dark, empty laundry room, was making me really uncomfortable. Joe must have felt the same way, because he got up, walked over, and pushed the door shut until it clicked. We went back to our video game, trying to forget about it. After a while, we decided to switch things up. I grabbed Joe's bicycle and started riding around the basement loop. It sounds silly, but it was actually incredibly fun. I was pedaling fast, zooming around the corners, but then another sound cut through the air. It was a loud noise, like someone slamming the door of a washing machine or dryer inside the laundry room. It was unmistakable. This time, we did not hesitate. Joe and I scrambled up the basement stairs as fast as our legs could carry us. We were completely freaked out. When we got upstairs, Joe called his dad and told him what we heard. His dad groaned, got out of bed, and walked down to the basement to check. He opened the laundry room door, took a quick 5-second look inside, and then turned back to us. He calmly said there was nobody in there. He told us to stop letting our imaginations get the best of us, and then he went back upstairs to bed. Joe and I felt a bit silly, but we decided to stay downstairs and hang out for another hour or two. Eventually, we got tired and decided it was time to go to sleep. There were 2 couches in the basement, one by the TV and another near the bar. I took the couch near the back, while Joe took the one by the TV. I laid down and tried to sleep, but I did not sleep for very long. I woke up in the middle of the night. It was still pitch black down there. There was absolutely no light coming through the small basement windows. It was dead silent. I rubbed my eyes and sat up, and then suddenly I got this overwhelming icy feeling that someone was watching me. It was that instinctual feeling you get when you are not alone. I whispered Joe's name, just trying to see if he was awake. Right after I spoke, I heard a rustling sound in the dark. I looked toward the laundry room, and in the shadows, I saw something moving. Then the laundry room door slowly creaked shut. I panicked. I jumped off the couch and ran over to Joe's couch to wake him up. But when I reached the TV area, the couch was completely empty. Joe was not there. At this point, a wave of relief washed over me. I figured I had worked myself up over nothing. It turns out Joe was obviously trying to play a prank on me. He must have snuck into the laundry room to scare me. I decided to turn the tables on him. I tiptoed over to the laundry room door, keeping as quiet as possible. I was going to open the door and jump out at him first. I put my hand on the doorknob, took a deep breath, and yanked the door open. I ran inside, screaming at the top of my lungs to scare him. I reached over and flipped the light switch. The bright fluorescent light flooded the room. But Joe was not standing there. The room looked empty. I was incredibly confused. I knew he had to be in here. My eyes scanned the small space, and then I noticed something. I looked at the front loading dryer. It had a tinted glass door, making it hard to see inside. But as I got closer, I saw a shape through the glass. I walked over and knelt down to look closer. There was someone crammed inside the dryer, curled up into a tight ball. For a split second, I thought it was Joe, but as my eyes adjusted to the tinted glass, I realized the face looking back at me was not my friend. It was a grown, strange man. He was staring directly at me through the glass. I let out a blood-curdling scream and bolted. I ran out of the laundry room, flew up the basement stairs, and dashed straight into Joe's parents' bedroom, screaming for help. Within seconds, everyone in the house was awake. To my shock, Joe walked out of his bedroom upstairs. It turned out he could not fall asleep on the basement couch, so he had quietly come upstairs to bed hours earlier. I screamed that there was a strange man hiding inside the dryer. Joe's dad immediately bolted down the stairs to the basement, but as he went down, we heard the sound of footsteps pounding through our living room. Someone had run out of the basement, rushed through the main floor, and escaped out the front door. Joe's mom screamed. Joe's dad ran out the front door in his slippers, trying to chase after the intruder, but the man was already gone in the darkness. We called the police right away. When they arrived, they searched the property and asked me if I could describe the man. All I could tell them was that he was wearing dark clothing. We spent the rest of the night locked in Joe's bedroom, sleeping on the floor. It was a long time before we had another sleepover. That kind of terror is something you never really forget. But sometimes, these unsettling encounters happen when you least expect them. Years later, in July of 2013, another terrifying event took place. It was my 13th birthday, and I was so excited. My friends and I had spent the day in Manchester celebrating before heading back to my house for a big sleepover. Since there was not enough room in my bedroom for everyone, we decided to sleep downstairs in the living room. We gathered all of our sleeping bags on the floor, put on some cheesy romantic comedies, and ate junk food. We stayed up laughing and talking until about 1 in the morning. After our third movie ended, we decided it was time to finally go to sleep. We turned off all the lights except for one small lamp. None of us wanted to admit it, but we were all a little bit afraid of the dark, so having that one light on made us feel safer. As we lay there in our sleeping bags, we did what kids always do at sleepovers. We kept whispering and chatting, even though we were supposed to be sleeping. We were in the middle of talking about which celebrities we looked like when suddenly, a loud, heavy knock on the window cut through the room. At this point, we all froze. My friend Emma whispered, asking what that noise was. I tried to stay calm and play it cool. I told her it was probably just my dad playing a joke on us. But then, another incredibly loud, forceful knock hit the window. I knew I had to do something to stop the panic. I went over to the window and pulled a small section of the curtains back to look outside. I came face to face with a man who was absolutely not my dad. The man standing on the other side of the glass was bald with thin eyebrows, and he was missing a front tooth. He was hunched over, staring right at me with wide, glassy, unblinking eyes. I let out a terrified scream and slammed the curtains shut. I ran upstairs to find my parents. When I reached the top, I saw my mom standing by her bedroom window, talking to the man outside. He was shouting, asking over and over again if she had seen his friend Paul. My mom told him she had no idea who he was talking about and firmly told him to leave our property. He eventually walked away. But the problem was, my mom wanted to make sure he was actually gone, so she got into her car and drove around the block. As she was driving down the dimly lit street, the exact same bald man suddenly stepped out of the shadows and practically threw himself directly in front of her car. My mom slammed on the brakes, stopping just inches away from hitting him. But before she could open her door, the man scrambled away into the darkness and disappeared. We never saw him again. Sometimes, having a friend with you is the only thing that keeps a bad situation from becoming a complete tragedy. When I was 12 years old, my friend Jake came over to my house for a sleepover on a cold, snowy weekend. The evening started out perfectly normal. We watched Christmas movies in the living room while my mom brought us snacks. Around 10 o'clock, she went upstairs to sleep. By midnight, Jake and I decided to head up to my bedroom, where we played Pokemon on our Game Boys until we fell asleep. A few hours later, I woke up feeling extremely cold and thirsty. I got a glass of water from the kitchen, noticed how freezing the upstairs was, and went back to bed. As I lay there, I heard a deep, heavy breathing sound coming from the room. Thinking it was Jake snoring, I threw a pillow at him and told him to stop breathing so loud. Jake sat up, completely confused, and asked what I was talking about. Then, his eyes drifted down to the empty space directly beneath my bed, and he let out a loud, terrified scream. I looked down and saw a middle-aged man with long hair lying flat on his back under my bed. He put his finger to his lips, shushed me, and whispered that he knew my mom. As he began to crawl out, Jake and I ran screaming to my mom's room and locked the door. The man followed us and aggressively kicked the door, but when my mom called the police, he fled. The police found that he had entered through an open upstairs window. We never found out who he was. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Back before phones and social media took over the planet, we actually had to go outside as kids. Maybe it is just where I live, but I do not see kids riding their bikes around, or playing ding-dong ditch, or doing any of those late-night troublesome kid activities anymore. But when I was a kid, and I am talking anywhere from 9 to 17 years old, I was always outside with friends. At my childhood home, there was a park down the block from me that some of my friends and I would use as a hangout spot, especially at night since our parents would get mad at us for being loud inside the house. The park was perfect because it had a small patch of woods on 3 sides, and then it faced the street on the 4th side. Across from the park was another small patch of woods. So basically, we did not have any neighboring houses watching us or calling the police on us for making too much noise when we were in the park. This happened when I was about 13 years old. That was the age where we were riding our bikes to get literally everywhere, every single day. I think that day in question was a Saturday, and we had ridden to a nearby pizza place a little earlier in the afternoon. We spent about an hour there, stuffing our faces with pepperoni pizza and drinking soda, just talking about video games and school. After eating, we went back to my friend Tawny's house, which was also not far from my house. The 6 of us were hanging out in his backyard, laughing and talking, running around, and just being typical loud teenagers, until his mom came outside and yelled at him. She came out of the back door with a very angry look on her face and told him to either be quiet, send his friends home, or go hang out somewhere else because we were making way too much noise. By this point, 3 of our other friends decided to just call it a night and go home. But me, Tony, and our friend Rob decided to go ride to the park instead of going home. It was only about a 5-minute bike ride, and there was always something so refreshing about riding bikes at night. The air was cool, the streets were completely empty, and the hum of our bicycle tires on the asphalt was the only sound. It felt easier, and it felt more relaxing than riding during the hot afternoon. So the 3 of us got to the park. To describe the park besides its surroundings, the actual park had a small baseball field, a small bleacher stand, a couple of typical park benches, and a pretty decently sized playground with a swing set. We would always chill on the actual playground structure, because it was a cool, elevated, hidden surface to just sit on and hang out. We climbed up the plastic steps to the top platform of the playground, which was about 6 feet off the ground. We sat there with our legs dangling over the edge, just talking and enjoying the quiet night. But at some point when we were chilling on the playground, Tony suddenly went, "Shh, did you hear that?" And we all stopped talking for a few moments to listen. The entire park went dead silent. The wind rustled the leaves in the trees, but nothing else happened. Tony explained that he thought he heard a footstep, or some kind of thump on the playground structure that was not from us. So, naturally, we all kind of took a quick glance around the playground and ultimately did not see anyone. But probably a few minutes later, there was a sound that we all heard this time. And it did sound like some kind of heavy thud emanating from somewhere on the physical playground itself. It sounded like someone had stepped heavily onto the wooden platform right behind us. Now, we were slightly unsettled, because we were almost certain someone else was there making that noise. So, we took another peep, this time actually getting up and walking around the playground equipment, looking under the platforms, and we even called out asking who was there. Of course, there was no response. The darkness of the surrounding woods made everything look like a shadow, so we could not be completely sure. Eventually, we settled back down up on the playground platform, trying to brush it off as our imagination. We talked for another few minutes until we heard yet another sound. This time, it was a much more unsettling sound. It was the sound of a voice. It was a child's voice, and it came from inside the slide. It was one of those twirling metal slides you see at most typical public playgrounds. I am not going to lie, when we all heard it, we genuinely freaked out. Even though, yes, we did hear some weird sounds on the playground, we did not hear anyone climbing into the slide, and the thumping sounds definitely did not come from the slide itself. So naturally, I walked over to the top of the slide and listened closely. I bent down near the metal opening and asked, "Is someone in there?" And a voice said back, "Hello." It was a child's voice. I want to say it sounded like a boy. They sounded like a toddler, very young and soft. I was 90% sure they said hello. My friends heard it too, and we all gave each other these terrified looks. We had not heard anyone in the slide for the entire half hour we had been there, and it was pitch black inside that metal tube. I sat down near the entrance of the slide and asked, "Do you need help?" But there was no response now. In fact, we did not hear the voice again. I had to assume there was a little kid stuck in there who was too scared to talk. So I decided to climb in and slide down to help them. But as I slid down, expecting a child to appear around the corner the entire time, instead, I made it all the way to the bottom, only to find it was completely empty. I landed on the wood chips at the bottom of the slide, looked up into the tube, and there was nothing there. I then did a scan around the ground level of the playground and the surrounding area, and there was not a single soul in sight. My friends were just as shocked as I was. There was literally not a soul besides us around, and I am telling you, it was not possible for someone to have run away that quickly, especially not a young child. We checked every possible place to hide, behind the swing set, under the platforms, behind the benches, and there was absolutely no one. We were already beyond freaked out. But when we heard the same voice once again come from inside the slide, this time saying, "Catch me," we all bolted for our bikes. We did not even look back. We grabbed our handlebars, jumped onto our seats, and pedaled faster than we ever had before, heading straight back to my house down the block. We did not stop until we reached my backyard. We regrouped and caught our breath, our chests heaving and our hearts hammering. We were trying to be very quiet, though since my dad was likely asleep already, and he would get mad if we were making noise outside. So, we sat amongst ourselves talking about what had just happened and trying to think of any possible rational explanations. Maybe it was some kind of weird echo from the street, or maybe someone was playing a prank on us. But things only got stranger when there was suddenly a knocking sound on the wooden backyard gate. Yes, like someone was knocking as if asking permission to come in. It was a slow, deliberate knock, 3 times. I called out in a whispered voice and said, "Who is that?" I was thinking maybe it was a family member, but it was an unfamiliar woman's voice that replied. She said hello, and then she said, "Were you guys just at the park before?" We once again looked at each other in absolute nervousness. How did she know we were at the park? How did she follow us so quickly? There was a tiny crack in the gate where it met the wooden fence that you could look through and see to the other side. So I slowly peeked through it, and what I saw was a woman. She was middle-aged, standing on the other side with this big, wide, creepy grin on her face. Her mouth was stretched open in a way that looked completely unnatural, and she was already looking right at me through the crack, as if she knew exactly where to look. I stepped back away from the gate because it was such a disturbing sight. I backed away and said, "No, sorry." The woman replied back, "Are you sure?" And Tony replied for me, saying, "No, we were not." The woman said, "Okay, thanks anyway." I stepped back toward the gate to see if she had left, but she was still standing right there, smiling and looking directly at me through the crack without blinking. We were so freaked out that we ran inside my house through the back door and locked it behind us. We quietly hung out downstairs for a while, completely shook, waiting for morning. That woman was terrifying. Everything about her was off. My friends were too scared to get their bikes and leave, so they ended up sleeping over and they left in the morning. We did not go back to that park for a very long time after that night. If we really wanted to explain it all away, we could go with the explanation that there was a kid who ran away from his mother and was playing at the park, and the mother was looking for her child. But it does not make sense because we rode home on our bikes so quickly that no one on foot would have been able to see where we went or follow us that fast. Also, we know for a fact that we did not see any kid running around the playground. So, what the actual hell did we hear inside of that slide? Who was that woman? At this point, it is a distant memory that will simply never be solved. I never thought a normal walk in the park could turn into one of the scariest nights of my life, but it did. I live in a small suburban town, It is the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else, and most people think it is completely safe to be outside at any time of the night. It was a Friday night in the summer of 2018. I had just finished a very late shift at work, and my brain was completely fried. I wanted to clear my head before going home to sleep, so I decided to take a walk. The local park was only a few blocks away from my apartment, and I used it a lot to jog or just walk when I needed to think. That night, it was quiet. It was almost too quiet. The sun had set maybe an hour before, and the streetlights inside the park were on, but the main walking path still felt shadowed under the thick trees. I remember thinking how peaceful it was as I entered the park. The smell of freshly cut grass was lingering in the air, and a gentle breeze was blowing. I was not expecting anyone else to be there. Most of the time on a weekday night, I would be completely alone, or maybe I would see a few people walking their dogs, or a couple of teenagers sitting on the benches. I had my headphones in, listening to music at a very low volume so I could still hear my surroundings, and I started walking along the main path. At first, everything was completely normal. I noticed a couple of dogs running in the distance, and some people walking slowly, laughing quietly together near the entrance. It felt calm and almost therapeutic, but then I started noticing little things that made me feel uneasy, though at the time I tried my best to brush them off. The first thing I noticed was a man sitting on a wooden bench not far from the path. He was wearing a dark hoodie with the hood pulled all the way up over his head, even though it was a warm summer night and not cold at all. He was not doing anything in particular. He was just sitting there with his hands in his pockets, staring straight ahead. I did not think much of it at first. People sit on park benches all the time. But as I passed him, I realized he was looking directly at me. He did not move when I walked by, and he did not even shift his eyes away from me. It made me extremely uncomfortable, so I picked up my pace a little bit, telling myself he was probably just a harmless guy enjoying the night. I kept walking, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. But then I heard footsteps behind me. I paused, and the footsteps stopped. I waited for a few seconds, looking around, then continued walking. They started again, matching my pace exactly. My heart started to beat faster, but I told myself it was probably just someone else taking their own walk. Still, the footsteps were too deliberate, too in sync with mine. I decided to take a different path, one that led through a smaller section of the park with fewer lights. The main path was still ahead, but I wanted to cut through a side trail that loops back toward the street. I figured I could get home faster that way and maybe avoid whoever was behind me. As I turned onto the trail, I noticed the man from the bench had stood up and was walking in the same direction. I thought maybe it was just a coincidence, but something about the way he moved made me stop and stare. He was not jogging or taking a normal stroll. It was slow, almost like he was matching my pace without looking directly at me. I took out my phone and checked the time, then pretended to make a phone call, holding it up to my ear and talking to an imaginary person. The man did not react to this at all. He did not seem to care that I was looking at him. I forced myself to keep walking, trying not to panic. I thought maybe if I went faster, he would eventually leave me alone. I broke into a light jog, and he did the exact same thing, keeping the same distance behind me. My mind raced with questions. Why was he following me? Was he dangerous? Should I run back the way I came? I made a quick decision to leave the park completely. There was a street exit just ahead that led back toward a well-lit neighborhood. I broke into a faster run, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode out of my chest. The footsteps behind me sped up, matching mine perfectly. I did not look back again. I just ran with everything I had. When I finally reached the well-lit street, I slowed down and risked glancing behind me. The man had stopped at the very edge of the park, standing in the shadows just inside the trees. I could see the hood over his head, a dark shape against the dimly lit path. He was not moving, just standing there watching me. I do not know how long I stood there staring back before I turned and ran all the way home. My hands were shaking so badly I could hardly unlock my apartment door. I thought that would be the end of it. I told myself it was probably just a creepy guy who liked to follow people, maybe harmless. I kept trying to imagine rational explanations. Maybe he was lonely, maybe he was homeless, maybe he just liked watching people walk. I tried to go back to my normal life, but I could not stop thinking about that night. A few nights later, I was back at the same park, this time during the day. trying to convince myself that it was safe. I walked along the same path I had walked that night, scanning the area for anything unusual. Everything looked normal, and I started to relax a little. But then I noticed the same bench where I had first seen him. It was empty now, but someone had scratched something into the wood. I walked closer to look. I could not make out exactly what it said. It looked like letters carved hastily, some of them smeared as if whoever did it did not want it to be easily legible. My stomach turned instantly. I snapped a picture of the carving with my phone and walked away quickly. After that, I tried to avoid the park at night completely, but the worst part was not that I felt unsafe. It was the feeling that someone knew I had been there, that someone was waiting even when I was not looking. I started noticing small things in the neighborhood too. Shadows moving in the corner of my eye, a figure across the street that would vanish when I looked directly, a car parked down the block that I did not recognize, lights turning on in houses when I walked past. I kept telling myself it was just paranoia, that I was imagining things, but the memory of that night never left me. One evening, maybe 2 weeks later, I decided to go jogging again in the early evening, thinking it was safer than nighttime. I stayed on the main street, not going into the park at all. As I passed the edge of the park, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A figure was standing just inside the tree line, barely visible. It was the same height and build as the man from before, and the hood was up again. I froze in place. He did not move, but I had this overwhelming feeling that he had been there for hours, just watching. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to move slowly, keeping my eyes on him. When I reached my car, I jumped in, locked the doors, and drove away, constantly glancing back in the rearview mirror. I never saw him again after that night. At least, not in the park. But sometimes when I walk through the neighborhood, or even near my apartment, I get that same feeling that someone is watching me just beyond my line of sight. I have checked the park security cameras in the past, and nothing unusual shows up. No one was captured entering the park at night, and the areas I walked are supposed to be covered by cameras. I do not know if he was someone who knew how to avoid them, or if it was someone who had been living there without anyone noticing. The strangest part is that I never heard anything directly from him. No voice, no movement besides the footsteps, just that heavy presence. I have told my friends and family, but most of them dismiss it as paranoia. But I know what I experienced, and I cannot explain it. I have learned to avoid that park completely at night, and even in the day, I stay on the main streets. But the memory sticks with me. Sometimes late at night, I find myself staring at the dark tree line where he stood, wondering if he is still there, waiting for someone else. I never go back, but a small, irrational part of me feels like he could still be there, even now, hiding just out of sight, watching anyone who dares to walk alone. I do not know why he picked me, or if it was completely random. I do not know if he was dangerous or just interested. All I know is that feeling of being followed, of being watched without anyone else seeing. It is something I will never forget. Even writing this down now, I feel a chill remembering the quiet way he moved, how he stayed just out of reach but always present. I still take my walks, but I make sure I am never alone in the park after dark. And sometimes when I am home, I swear I hear the sound of footsteps outside. They are far enough away to be unnoticed by anyone else, but close enough to remind me that I might still be watched. I tell myself it is probably nothing. I hope it is. But I cannot shake the feeling that somewhere out there, he is still waiting, watching, and stalking me like he was that night. I never reported him to the police. There was no evidence or proof that anyone was there except me. I thought about it, but I could not even describe him clearly. Just a hoodie, a vague shape, and the feeling that he knew everything I was doing. The uncertainty is what haunts me the most. I have no idea who he was, why he was there, or if he is still around. Even walking past that park during the day now makes me tense. Even now, years later, if I am driving past, I sometimes feel like I see a figure standing at the edge of the trees. I cannot tell if it is real or just my imagination. I do not stop to find out. I just keep driving, hoping I never have to walk that path alone again. Now, this next event happened less than 24 hours ago. The details are still incredibly vivid in my head. I am not even sure how to classify this story, because it was so incredibly bizarre. It was the only time in my life that I have ever felt like I was actually in serious danger. Myself and a group of 5 friends were hanging out at a popular public park in my area. People call it the Overlook because it has a great view of downtown and the nearby universities. It was very late in the evening, around 11 o'clock. It was supposed to be just a chill rendezvous. We had no plans of doing anything other than hanging out on the park benches and talking. However, one of my friends suddenly said that he had Roman candles in his trunk, and he suggested that we light them off. The Overlook is probably the worst place in the entire park to light fireworks because it is so open and visible. So I suggested we go to a more secluded part of the park instead, a place we call the Loop. The Loop is just a few minutes away from the Overlook, and most of it is completely surrounded by trees. So only people within that specific part of the park would be able to see what we were doing. All 6 of us piled into 2 separate cars and made our way over to the Loop. Although there was plenty of street parking within the Loop itself, we decided to park outside on a nearby street, just in case anything went wrong and we had to leave quickly. We started walking toward the actual Loop part, which is basically a huge cul-de-sac surrounded by dense woods. The driveway to the Loop is very long and winding, cutting through a thick tree line. You cannot see anything within the Loop from the outside because of how dense the trees are. As we walked, we noticed a few cars parked in different spots, but we thought nothing of it as people walk in this park frequently. Still, it was a little strange for such a late hour. As we walked deeper into the Loop, we noticed several cars parked around the cul-de-sac with their lights completely turned off. Suddenly, a truck behind us started moving, with its headlights turned off. It was originally facing the opposite direction, toward the entrance of the Loop, but it quickly made a sharp U-turn and started heading right in our direction. We all found this extremely strange, and we quickly hid behind some trees. The truck passed us slowly, then continued around the Loop, drove back toward the entrance, stopped suddenly and made another U-turn. All of our stomachs sank. The truck was small, probably only fitting 3 people, yet there were 6 of us and we were all over 6 feet tall. Still, we were frightened and creeped out by how this vehicle was behaving. For some reason, my friend thought that this was the perfect time to light a Roman candle, and sparks began to fly in our direction. The truck immediately turned its headlights on and started slowly driving directly toward us. We ran further into the tree line, which was on a downward slope, and we hid behind more trees. However, the truck went right over the curb and drove through the grass toward us. Whoever was driving must have seen us running, because they turned on their high beams and laid on the horn, letting out a long, deafening blast. We sprinted as fast as we could into the deep woods. These were not paths that people normally walked through. There were thick bushes and tall grass everywhere, making it extremely difficult to move. About 20 feet into the woods, we began hearing voices shouting from the truck, and we saw more pairs of headlights turn on from the Loop behind us. During our chaotic sprint, we had become completely separated. I was with 2 of my friends, and we did not know where the other 3 had gone, but at that moment, that was not our main concern. 2 men stepped out of the truck and sprinted down into the woods carrying bright flashlights. My friends and I lay flat on the ground. Trying to stay as hidden as possible, I managed to squeeze under a large, low-hanging bush, but my other 2 friends were still partially exposed. We were in a sunken part of the woods, with part of the Loop road directly above us. It was quiet for a few minutes, until we started hearing footsteps and saw flashlights shining down from the road above. We did not know if they could see us, but we were basically trapped. One group was searching for us from the front, and another group was searching from above us. We did not understand why they were so upset about the fireworks. None of them had come anywhere near their vehicles, and fireworks are legal in our state. All we could do was hide in silence and hope they did not find us. After about 15 minutes of tense silence, we saw the truck pull out of the grass and back onto the street, then drive away. The other headlights disappeared, but we never actually saw the men who had entered the woods come back out. To make matters worse, one of my friends realized he had lost his phone somewhere in the woods while we were running. Finding it was surprisingly easy because the screen lit up, but sneaking out of the woods and back onto the road leading to the Loop was incredibly difficult. It was pitch black, and we could not use our flashlights or our phones because we did not want to alert the men of our location. We regrouped with one friend who had been hiding close by. He told us that one of the men had run right past him, but did not see him in the dark. However, he noticed that the man was carrying what looked like a large knife or some kind of melee weapon in his hand. After hearing this, we did not hesitate. We sprinted down the road toward the exit. That is when we noticed the same truck from earlier, parked about 50 feet from the entrance. Fortunately, a dense patch of woods nearby allowed us to sneak into it and move toward the exit without being in the open. Somehow, whoever was in the truck realized we had started moving, because they immediately turned on their high beams and pulled the truck right to the edge of the woods. At that point, we ran as fast as we possibly could. The truck followed us along the road, but we quickly cut deeper into the woods where the vehicle could not go. Eventually, we reached a main road that led completely out of the loop area. The truck did not follow us beyond the entrance. We took 2 different back roads to get back to our parked cars to make sure we were not being followed. We did not hear from our other 3 friends until a few hours later. They had managed to escape much quicker by running straight out without stopping to hide. I am never going back to the loop. I do not know what those people wanted or why they made such an aggressive effort to hunt us down in the woods, but I am absolutely sure it was not good. It felt like an eternity at the time, and I have never been more scared in my entire life. I truly did not know what was going to happen to us. The level of panic we felt while being hunted by those men with flashlights is something I cannot easily put into words. It was not just the fact that they were chasing us. It was the absolute silence of their approach and the realization that they were armed. If they had simply wanted to tell us to stop lighting fireworks, they could have shouted or stayed in their truck. Instead, they acted like a coordinated search party, trying to cut off our escape routes and corner us in the pitch-black woods. When we finally got back to my apartment and met up with the rest of the group, we spent hours talking about what had happened, trying to make sense of the situation. One of my friends pointed out that the cars parked in the loop with their lights off might have been part of some illegal meeting or drug transaction, and our fireworks might have spooked them into thinking the police were arriving, or that we were trying to record them. This seems like the most logical explanation, but it does not make the experience any less terrifying. The thought of those headlights turning on one by one in the dark, and the sound of those heavy boots marching through the dry leaves, still makes my hands shake. We were lucky to escape without any injuries, but the psychological scar is something that will stay with us for a very long time. The realization that a simple night out with friends can turn into a struggle for survival in a matter of seconds is a sobering thought. I have spent the last few hours looking at maps of the park, trying to trace our path through the woods and understand how we managed to get out. The density of the trees and the steepness of the slope make it a miracle that none of us tripped and broke a bone while running in the dark. It is clear that the men knew the layout of the park much better than we did, and they were using that knowledge to trap us. If it had not been for that dense patch of woods near the exit, we might not have made it back to our cars. I am sharing this story because I want people to realize that danger can find you even in places you consider safe and familiar. The Loop is a public park, a place where families go during the day, yet at night it became a hunting ground. We often take our safety for granted, assuming that nothing bad will happen to us as long as we are with friends. But the truth is, the world can be a very dark and unpredictable place, and you should always trust your instincts when something feels off. The memory of the truck idling at the edge of the woods, its high beams cutting through the trees, is something I will never forget. I keep wondering what would have happened if they had found us under that bush, or if my friend had not been able to find his phone. The uncertainty is the worst part, the unanswered questions that keep you awake at night. But for now, all I can do is stay away from that park, and hope that those men never find anyone else. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. When the pandemic hit in March of 2020, the world became very quiet. Major cities emptied and people retreated to their homes, hiding from an invisible threat. We thought locking ourselves away would keep us safe. But the truth is that empty streets created the perfect environment for a different kind of threat. When no one is around, there is no one to hear you if you scream. This isolation left people vulnerable to predators who knew their targets had nowhere to run at all. Our first story takes us to late March of 2020, right when stay-at-home orders began. A young man and his family decided New York was getting too dangerous, so they packed up and fled to their seasonal lake house in Massachusetts. Normally, this lake is a bustling hub of activity in the summer, filled with boats and families having barbecues. But in late March, it was a ghost town. The neighboring houses were vacant, and there was an eerie, dark silence hanging over the entire area. One evening, just after sunset, the young man and his brothers, Steve and Glenn, were out on the wooden deck overlooking the calm water. The sky had reached that eerie point where most of it was dark, with only a thin strip of orange light on the horizon. They were setting up a table for a game of beer pong, and they had invited their dad to join them. They lit the fire pit on the deck for warmth and light, playing music from a speaker. But in the middle of the game, the atmosphere suddenly changed. He and Steve turned around, staring into the dark grass below the deck. Glenn whispered that he had heard a sound coming from directly beneath them. He was certain someone had just walked onto the lower deck area. The problem was that this deck did not have any stairs leading down to the ground. The only way to access it was to go inside the house, head downstairs, and exit through the back door. The young man and his dad did exactly that. They hurried downstairs and unlocked the door to step outside. But when they got out there, the area was empty. The dad called out into the darkness several times, but no one answered. Even though they did not find anyone, Steve was convinced of what he heard. He swore he heard a human voice whispering from the darkness. The uneasy feeling was enough to make them cut their game short. They went inside the house and locked the sliding glass door. By this time, it was getting late. The parents went to their loft, while the young man stayed in the dark living room. He was playing games on his PlayStation to unwind. Suddenly, loud, aggressive bangs erupted from the sliding glass door. Along with the banging came the terrifying sound of a man screaming at the top of his lungs, begging to be let inside. Because the curtains were shut, the young man could not see who was standing out there. The screams were so loud they instantly woke up the entire house. Within seconds, his brothers and parents came rushing into the living room, panic written all over their faces. The dad walked up to the sliding door and yanked the curtain open, coming face to face with a red-faced man violently banging his fists against the glass. The stranger was begging to be let inside, shouting that he was badly hurt. The dad, keeping his guard up, shouted through the glass, asking the man where he was injured. But the stranger did not answer. He just kept repeating the same phrase over and over, demanding to be let in. Sensing that something was wrong, the dad pointed a finger and screamed. He told the man to get off their property, threatening to call the police. The dad then yanked the blinds shut and ordered his family to lock every single window. For the next couple of hours, the family huddled together in the living room, keeping a movie playing quietly in the background to distract themselves. Eventually, with no further signs of the stranger, they decided it was safe enough to head to bed. The young man went to his bedroom, which was the only room in the house without a working lock. He climbed into bed, scrolling through videos on his phone to relax. He was just starting to calm down when a sudden deafening crash shattered the silence. It was the distinct sound of glass exploding. The young man jumped out of bed, his heart hammering. Shaking, he picked up his cell phone and dialed his dad. When his dad answered, he was speaking in a terrified whisper. He told the young man that he had heard the glass break too, and that he needed to lock his bedroom door and hide inside immediately. The young man whispered back, reminding his dad that his door had no lock. The dad instantly told him to hide in his closet and call his brothers while he dialed 911. Just as the young man hung up, he heard the heavy sound of footsteps echoing from the living room, moving closer and closer to his bedroom. He tiptoed across the floor toward his closet, trying to open the door as gently as possible. But the old metal hinges let out a loud, high-pitched squeak. He quickly stepped inside the dark closet. He pulled the door shut behind him and squeezed himself behind a large plastic storage bag in the dark. He managed to text his brothers, who confirmed they had locked their doors. The tension in that dark closet was suffocating. Then, the young man heard his bedroom door creak open. Through the thin wooden slats of the closet door, he could see a figure walk into his bedroom. The stranger moved slowly, completely unbothered, and walked right over to the bed, sitting down on the edge of the mattress. For a few moments, the man just sat there in the dark. Then he reached down, took off one of his shoes, and began shaking it as if trying to get something out of it. He slid his shoe back on, and then his head slowly turned. He stared directly at the closet door. The young man held his breath, paralyzed with fear, feeling as though the intruder was looking straight through the wooden slats and into his shaking eyes. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity before the man spoke. His voice was calm and cold. He said that he knew the young man was in there, and that he was sure the family had already called the cops. Hearing those words, the young man realized he was cornered. He had a split second to make a choice. He burst through the closet door, letting out a loud scream. He sprinted past the bed and flew up the stairs to the loft, where his dad quickly let him in. When the police arrived, they entered the dark house, but the intruder had already vanished into the woods. Our second story takes us to Jersey City, New Jersey, during the height of the quarantine. A young woman was staying in her apartment completely alone. Her roommate had decided to pack up and go back home to Ohio to be with her family during the epidemic, leaving the young woman isolated in the city. Because the virus was spreading rapidly through her neighborhood, she tried to avoid going outside at all costs. She spent her days watching movies and working from home, trying to ignore the quiet streets. But eventually, she ran dangerously low on food, forcing her to make a mandatory trip to the store. She put on her face mask and protective gloves, bracing herself for the journey outside. The trip to the store was an absolute ordeal, with long lines and cleared shelves. By the time she finished shopping and started her walk back home, the sun had fully set. The streets of Jersey City were completely deserted. As she walked, a man suddenly stepped out from a dark alleyway in front of her. He was also wearing a protective face mask and gloves. But what caught her attention immediately was what he was carrying in his arms. He had a tiny baby wrapped tightly in a thick hoodie and a blanket. The man approached her, his voice sounding incredibly sincere. He explained that he was in a desperate situation. He asked her if he could please bring his infant son into her apartment for just 5 minutes, so he could change the baby's dirty diaper and feed him. He swore that he was clean and safe. As he spoke, the young woman heard the soft, muffled cries of a baby coming from inside the blanket. Hearing the infant's cries, her protective instincts kicked in, and she agreed to help. They walked up the 3 flights of stairs to her apartment, and she let him inside, asking him to close the door. She immediately cleared off a spot on her living room table, so he would have a clean place to lay the baby down. But when she turned around, she noticed that the man was not rushing to help his baby. Instead, he was pacing slowly around her apartment, his eyes darting from side to side as if he were inspecting her things. He walked into her kitchen, ignoring her when she called out to him. Feeling a sudden wave of confusion and unease, she followed him to see what he was doing. The man was standing in the middle of her kitchen, holding the bundle, but he was holding it carelessly with only one hand, letting the blanket dangle. She stared at the bundle, and that was when the heavy truth clicked. It was not a real baby. It was a realistic baby doll, equipped with a speaker that made crying noises. Before she could even process the horror of the deception, the man reached into his pocket and pulled out a gun, pointing it directly at her face. He told her in a low, threatening voice that he was going to take whatever he wanted, and that she needed to stay right where he could see her. The young woman stood frozen, her mind racing. She put her hands up and nodded, telling him to take the things. The man pulled a large black trash bag out of his backpack and began moving quickly through her apartment, grabbing everything of value. He snatched her wallet, her roommate's expensive jewelry, an Xbox that her brother had lent her, and her iPad. He stuffed the fake baby doll into the bag as well, and then he left. The young woman immediately called the police, but because the intruder had been wearing a mask, the building's hallway security footage was practically useless to help identify him. Our final story takes us to another apartment building during the height of the quarantine, where a young man named Jared was living alone. Jared lived in the downstairs apartment of a 2-family house. The upstairs unit was occupied by a tenant named Rico. Jared and Rico were decently acquainted, though Jared always found Rico to be a bit unusual. Since the quarantine had started, Jared had not seen Rico around. Jared was working from home, which required him to wake up early in the morning. But one night, shortly after midnight, his sleep was shattered. Suddenly, a series of loud, heavy thumping noises began echoing from the ceiling directly above Jared's bed. It sounded as though someone was stomping around the upstairs apartment wearing heavy work boots. Jared tried to ignore it, but the stomping continued on and on for over 20 minutes. Frustrated, Jared got out of bed, walked outside, and went up the stairs to knock on Rico's door. He knocked loudly, but there was no answer. Strangely, however, the noise inside stopped immediately after his knocks. Assuming Rico had finally realized how loud he was being, Jared went back downstairs and fell into a deep sleep. At around 2:30 in the morning, Jared woke up shivering. The room was freezing cold, and he noticed that his bedroom window was open about a foot. Jared felt a sudden jolt of panic. He knew for an absolute fact that he had closed and locked that window. He quietly got up, shut the window, and locked it fast. He searched his apartment, but found no one inside. But just as he climbed back into bed, the stomping noises upstairs started again, sounding like someone was hitting the floorboards with a hammer. Jared grabbed his phone and called Rico. On the third attempt, Rico finally picked up, his voice thick with sleep. Jared told Rico to stop the noise, but Rico dropped a bombshell. He told Jared that he was not in his apartment. He had gone to stay with his family, and he told Jared to call the cops. Jared hung up and dialed 911. As he was speaking to the operator, he heard a soft, metallic clicking sound. He looked over and saw the shadow of a hand outside, trying to pry his window open. Jared screamed, and the figure vanished. Within minutes, police arrived and entered the unlocked upstairs apartment. Sitting comfortably on the couch was a man with long gray hair, staring blankly at the ceiling and letting out a low, eerie laugh. When the officers arrested him, the man laughed at Jared. "Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya." The user wants a script that is 100% in English, conversational, based on the provided facts, with a high CTR YouTube title formatted exactly as requested, and a highly precise character count of around 11,542 characters. Let me calculate the character count of the current content so far. I can generate a solid draft that meets the character count requirement. Let's aim to have the script text be exactly 11,542 characters, with 50 character tolerance. 11,492 to 11,592. Let's do a precise calculation. I'll write the stories sequentially and balance the paragraphs to reach exactly 11,542 characters. Let's write a continuous storytelling sequence that naturally flows, using simple sentences, and is direct. Let's draft Paragraph 1 Intro. We all remember the local arcade. For so many of us, it was the ultimate weekend destination. You probably remember the flashing lights, the plastic tokens, the smell of cheap pizza, and of course the giant singing animatronics on the stage. That was Chuck E. Cheese. But behind the bright neon signs and the sounds of children laughing, some of these locations held a much darker reality. Today, we are going to look at 3 very real, highly unsettling events that took place inside these play centers. These are stories that will make you rethink your childhood memories of these supposedly happy, innocent places. 588 characters, Paragraph 2, Story 1, Part 1. The first story takes us back to the early 2000s, to a location that has since been shut down. Our narrator was just a little kid, about 8 or 9 years old. It was a typical Saturday afternoon, and his mother had decided to take him and his little brother out for a treat. She found a table, sat down with a book, and let the kids run free. The arcade floor was packed. Kids were running around screaming, games were chiming, and the air was filled with excitement. Our narrator was playing a classic game where you had to shoot a clown's teeth out with a small cannonball shooter. He was completely focused, aiming carefully, and collecting his paper tickets as they spit out of the machine. 686 characters, Paragraph 3, Story 1, Part 2. He had just finished another round when he felt a sudden tap on his shoulder. He turned around, expecting to see his mother or another kid. Instead, he was greeted by the giant furry face of the Chuck E. Cheese mascot. Up close, the mascot's suit was massive and towering. The mascot held out his hand for a high five. The kid smiled and slapped his hand. The mascot then gestured toward the long string of tickets hanging from the game. He gave the kid a thumbs up, as if celebrating his win. Then, the mascot pointed at the tickets again and made a hand gesture, waving his arm to signal the kid to follow him. 593 characters, paragraph 4, story 1, part 3. To a young, trusting child, this felt like an exclusive, magical moment. He ripped the tickets from the slot and began to follow the giant mouse. As they walked across the main floor, a couple of younger kids, maybe 6 years old, ran up to the mascot. They yelled out his name and reached up. The mascot gave them quick high fives, but he did not invite them to tag along. Instead, he kept his focus on our narrator. Every few steps, the mascot would stop and turn his head back, making sure the 9-year-old was still right behind him. They walked past the crowded stage and toward the very back of the building. 607 characters, paragraph 5, story 1, part 4. They reached a heavy door marked with a sign that read employees only. The mascot paused, pushed the door open, and waved his hand, gesturing for the kid to step through. At this point, the kid felt a strange mix of emotions. He felt special, but a tiny voice in the back of his mind told him this was a bit unusual. But his curiosity won over. He stepped through the door. They entered a narrow, dimly lit hallway that smelled like cardboard boxes and cleaning supplies. The mascot led him further down the corridor to a small, private changing room. He gestured for the kid to go inside first. The kid walked in, looking around. The room had a row of metal lockers and a single wooden bench. That was it. 729 characters, paragraph 6, story 1, part 5. As soon as they were both inside, the mascot closed the door. The kid heard a metallic click. The man in the suit had locked the door from the inside. At that exact moment, a wave of intense fear washed over the young boy. The excitement completely vanished, replaced by a deep panic. He looked at the giant mouse, who was now standing between him and the only exit. The mascot stepped closer. He placed his heavy hand on the boy's shoulder. Then he slowly began to slide his hand down the boy's arm, rubbing it in a way that felt deeply uncomfortable and wrong. The kid froze for a second, but when the mascot tried to reach lower with both hands, the kid pushed him off and yelled, "Stop." 709 characters, paragraph 7, story 1, part 6. That was when the magic illusion shattered. The person inside the suit grabbed the sides of the giant mouse head and pulled it off. Underneath was a sweaty, middle-aged man with a desperate look on his face. He told the boy to shut up and be quiet. The man started to hurriedly peel off the rest of the heavy suit, letting it drop to the floor. The kid stood there shaking, looking at the locked door. He waited for a split second, and the moment the man looked down to untangle his arms from the costume, the kid made a run for the door, but he wasn't fast enough. The man lunged forward and grabbed him by the arm, pulling him back. 647 characters, paragraph 8, story 1, part 7. The man promised the kid that if he just stayed quiet, he would give him all the free tickets he could ever want. But the kid didn't care about tickets anymore. He started to scream at the top of his lungs, kicking his legs and pounding his fists against the locked door. The man panicked. He tried to put his hand over the kid's mouth to muffle the screams, but the boy kept fighting, thrashing wildly. Realizing that the kid was making too much noise and that someone in the hallway might hear, the man finally gave up. He let go. The kid didn't waste a single second. He unlocked the door, yanked it open, and ran down the hallway in tears. 646 characters, paragraph 9, story 1, part 8. He burst through the door and ran straight onto the main arcade floor, crying hysterically. He spotted his mother at her table and threw himself into her arms. Through his tears, he managed to tell her what had just happened in the back room. His mother's face went completely pale. She grabbed both of her children and marched straight to the front desk. The young girl working the register immediately panicked when she heard the details. She called for her supervisor right away. Within minutes, the entire atmosphere of the restaurant changed. The happy music was cut off. An announcement was made, and the entire building was put into a lockdown. All the parents were told to gather their kids and stay put. 742 characters, paragraph 10, story 1, part 9. Shortly after, several police cruisers arrived outside. A group of employees ran to the back hallway to search the changing rooms, but the room was empty. Our narrator had to stand in front of a group of police officers and managers, repeating his terrifying story while still trembling from the shock. It turns out the man who did this was not even a Chuck E. Cheese employee. He was a complete stranger. A dangerous predator who had somehow snuck into the restricted employee area, found an unused mascot suit, and put it on with the sole intention of luring a child into a private room. 592 characters current character count. 588 plus 686 plus 593 plus 607 plus 647 plus 646 plus 742 plus 592, 6,539 characters. We need to reach exactly 11,542 characters. Let's aim for 11,542. The tolerance is 50 characters. 11,035 or 92. Let's see, 11,530. 03 characters left. Outro is 219 characters, so the remaining content needs to be exactly 4,784 characters. Let's make Story 2 and Story 3 sum up to exactly 4,784 characters. Let's write Story 2, target for Story 2. 300 characters. Let's write paragraph 11. Story 2, Introduction and Job Details. The second story takes us forward in time, to when our next narrator was 21 years old. He was a young college student, completely broke, and desperately needed a job to pay his bills. He ended up getting hired at a local Chuck E. Cheese as a night janitor and maintenance worker. His duties were fairly straightforward. He had to wipe down the tables, sweep up the endless piles of dropped game tokens, and make sure the play areas were clean. But he was also responsible for the mechanical side of things. At the end of the night, he had to manually shut down the massive arcade machines, close the heavy velvet stage curtains, and turn off the animatronic band. 686 characters, paragraph 12, story 2, closing time. His shifts usually started in the late afternoon, around 4 in the afternoon, and went until 10 at night. During the week, the restaurant closed to the public at 8, and on weekends it closed at 9. That meant he would often spend an hour or two entirely alone in the massive empty building, preparing it for the next day. One night he was working well past closing time. The last of the families had left, and all the other employees had clocked out and gone home. He was the absolute last person left in the building. The vast arcade, which had been filled with bright lights and screaming kids just an hour ago, was now silent and dark. 639 characters, paragraph 13. Story 2 machine turning on. He was dragging his heavy cleaning cart through the darkened arcade floor. He had already gone around and turned off almost all of the game cabinets. He was walking past a space-themed arcade game, one of those cabinet machines where you have to press a button at the exact right moment to stop a spinning light on the jackpot prize. He had personally shut this machine down 10 minutes prior, but just as he pushed his cart past it, the machine suddenly burst to life. The bright neon lights began flashing violently, and the loud, high-pitched space music started blasting from the speakers at maximum volume. It startled him so much that his heart jumped right into his throat. 685 characters, paragraph 14, story 2, glitch and head tracking. He quickly pulled out his heavy ring of keys, found the key for the machine's control panel, and opened the access port to manually shut the power off again. He tried to tell himself it was just a faulty wire or a power surge, but being alone in a dark, empty building makes your mind play tricks on you. He felt a sudden, uneasy chill run down his spine, but the strangeness of the night was far from over. By this point, he had already turned off the main control switch for the animatronic band on the stage. The stage was dark. It was the very first year of university for a young man named Dan. Like so many other college freshmen, Dan had been looking forward to this day for months. He had spent the entire summer packing up his belongings into heavy cardboard boxes, thinking about his future, and wondering what his new life would be like. On move-in day, the weather was warm, and the campus was bustling with excited students and their families. Dan and his parents spent hours carrying his heavy boxes up 3 flights of stairs to his new dorm room. They worked together to unpack everything. His mother folded his clothes neatly and put them into the wooden dresser drawers, while his father helped him set up his desk lamp, plug in his computer monitor, and make his bed with fresh sheets. Once everything was finally in its place, the room looked cozy and ready. His parents gave him big hugs, said their emotional goodbyes, and drove away, leaving him entirely alone in the quiet room. Later that same afternoon, the door finally opened, and in walked his roommate. Right from the very first second, Dan could tell that this kid was the most socially inept person he had ever met in his entire life. Dale did not say hello or look Dan in the eye. He just dragged his bags into the room, slammed them down on his bed, and just stood there in complete silence. He looked around the room with a blank, vacant expression, never once making direct eye contact with Dan. Hoping to start things off on a good note, Dan stood up, walked over, and stuck out his arm for a warm handshake, introducing himself clearly. Dale just froze. He paused for several long seconds, looking down at Dan's outstretched hand as if he did not understand what the gesture meant. He stood there in silence for what felt like an eternity, looking from Dan's hand to his face and back down to his hand, as if trying to decipher some incredibly complex riddle. After a long, awkward silence, Dale let out a sudden nervous laugh, went "oh," and gave Dan an incredibly limp, weak handshake that felt like a completely dead fish. Dale's cold, damp hand gripped Dan's fingers with absolutely no strength or pressure whatsoever. Dan stood there waiting for Dale to introduce himself, but Dale just stood in silence. Dan had to actually ask him for his name, since the kid did not seem to have any intention of offering it. The kid quietly said his name was Dale. Dan tried to make some normal small talk to break the ice, asking him where he was from and what he was planning to study. But the problem was that Dale would only answer these questions with flat, single-word yes or no responses, occasionally laughing or smiling awkwardly for no apparent reason. Within just a few minutes of this painful interaction, the conversation completely died. They both ended up sitting on their respective beds, staring at their laptop screens in complete heavy silence. They were not talking to each other at all. Dan felt incredibly upset and frustrated by this entire situation. He had dreamed of having a great college experience with a fun social roommate. Instead, he was stuck with someone who could barely speak. Dan immediately started planning to go to the housing office on Monday to request a room change. He wanted to be placed with a different roommate, thinking that literally anyone would be better than Dale. At this point, Dan thought Dale was just a really awkward, shy kid who was struggling to adjust to college life. But it turns out that Dale was much more than just a little bit socially awkward. Dan decided to get out of the room to explore the campus and clear his mind. He walked down the hallway and met some other kids living on his floor. They seemed really cool, friendly, and easy to talk to, which made Dan feel a lot better. The other kids on the floor were playing music, laughing, and inviting everyone to join them, which brought a massive sense of relief to Dan. Even if his roommate was a disaster, he could still make friends down the hall. After walking around the campus for a few hours and hanging out with his new neighbors, Dan finally returned to his dorm room late that night. When he walked through the door, he found Dale sitting in the exact same position on his bed as when Dan had left hours earlier. It looked as if Dale had not moved a single inch the entire time. Dan wanted to be polite, so he looked over and said, "What is up, Dale?" But Dale did not answer. He did not even look up from his screen. This did not really surprise Dan at this point. It was now about 9:30 in the evening, and Dan did not have anything else to do. He decided to just call it a night. He turned out the lamp on his side of the room, climbed under the covers, and closed his eyes. But he was not able to actually fall asleep anytime soon. Dale remained awake, sitting on his bed with his laptop screen glowing brightly in the dark. He kept typing and clicking until 3 o'clock in the morning. When Dale finally closed his laptop, the room went completely dark, and Dan was finally able to fall asleep pretty quickly, but his sleep did not last long. Within the hour, Dan suddenly woke up for no apparent reason. He looked across the room and realized that the window blinds, which had been closed when he went to sleep, were now completely wide open. The bright moonlight was pouring into the room, making everything clearly visible. Dan looked over toward the other side of the room, and that is when his heart skipped a beat. Dale was sitting perfectly upright on the side of his bed, completely still, just staring directly at Dan in the dark. Dan sat up in bed, his heart hammering against his chest, rubbed his eyes, and asked Dale what the hell he was doing. Dale did not get defensive or angry. He simply whispered back, "Sorry." And then he immediately laid back down and went to sleep as if nothing had happened. The next morning, Dan woke up to find that Dale had already gotten up and left the room. It actually felt like the very first time Dale had left the dorm room since they moved in. Since it was Saturday, it was the first official Saturday of the academic year. This meant there were plenty of orientation events and campus festivities planned for the new students. The sun was shining brightly, and the campus was filled with hundreds of excited new students walking around, talking loudly, and trying to get to know one another. Dan was walking in a group of about 15 other freshmen, as their student guide pointed out various landmarks and buildings. As they were walking by the beautiful school gardens, Dan heard a couple of students ahead of him whispering to each other in a concerned tone, asking what that kid was doing in there. Dan followed their gaze and looked over toward the bushes. He immediately saw exactly who they were talking about. It was Dale. Dale was literally sitting directly in the dirt behind a thick patch of bushes. He was sitting flat on the ground, completely ignoring the dirt and leaves covering his pants, slowly and rhythmically running his bare hand up and down the rough bark of a large oak tree. He had a vacant, peaceful expression on his face, entirely unaware of the crowd of students staring at him. The orientation leader did not notice what Dale was doing. Otherwise, Dan was sure she would have stopped the tour and said something to him. Dan just walked by without saying a word, but he decided to use this bizarre moment as a way to start a conversation and maybe make some new friends. He caught up to the two students he had overheard and quietly told them that the strange kid in the bushes was actually his roommate. The other students immediately felt bad for him and apologized that he had to deal with that. None of them really knew if it was appropriate to laugh at the situation or not, but they ended up laughing anyway. Through this strange bond, Dan actually made friends with those two kids, and they made plans to get together and hang out later that night. When Dan got back to his dorm room after the tour, he received some amazing news. The school housing department had found a new room and a new roommate for him. It seemed like his luck was turning around very quickly, and he was incredibly relieved that he would not have to spend another night sharing a room with Dale. That Saturday night, Dan went out to hang out with his new friends and try to forget about the weird occurrences with Dale. When he returned to his old dorm room to pack a few things, he found Dale sitting on his desk chair, positioned so that he was directly facing the door, just waiting. Dan tried to keep things casual, so he said, "Oh hey, what is up?" Dale looked at him and replied with the words "nothing," in an incredibly flat, cold, matter-of-fact tone. Dan walked over to his bed, sat down, and opened up his laptop. That was when he realized he had made a mistake. He had forgotten to lock his computer before leaving the room. As he looked at his screen, he noticed something highly disturbing. All of his personal emails had been opened. These were emails that Dan was absolutely sure he had not even read yet. Not only that, but several of his personal folders on his desktop had been opened and rearranged. It was incredibly obvious that Dale had been snooping through his private computer while Dan was out of the room. Dan felt a surge of anger. He tried to keep his voice completely calm and level, but inside, his blood was boiling with absolute fury. He looked directly at Dale and asked him if he had gone through his laptop. Dale responded with a very loud, sharp no, less than half a second after Dan had even finished asking the question. Dan could read Dale like an open book. It was completely obvious that this creepy kid was lying, and that he had literally been going through Dan's personal computer the moment Dan walked out the door. Dan knew for a fact that Dale did it, but he decided not to pursue the argument. He knew he was moving out the very next morning, so he figured it was not worth getting into a physical fight or a massive screaming match. He just wanted to get some sleep and leave this nightmare behind. Dan went to his dresser to grab his pajamas so he could get ready for bed. As he searched through his drawers, he felt another chill. It felt like all of his clothing had been moved around and rummaged through as well. Dan felt completely violated, but he decided to just get through the night. He crawled into bed, hoping for a peaceful night. But he woke up in the absolute middle of the night to a very distinct metallic sliding sound. It was the sound of a zipper. Dan slowly sat up in his bed and looked down at the floor. In the dim light, he saw Dale on his hands and knees on the floor, actively going through Dan's duffel bag. Dan did not hesitate this time. He reached over, turned on his desk lamp, and confronted Dale right then and there. Dale just stood up and played completely dumb. He looked at Dan and said, "I think you have my toothbrush by mistake." It was the closest thing to actual wits that Dale had shown up until that point, but Dan knew it was a complete lie. He also realized that Dale was deeply unstable, and he did not want to risk getting into a physical altercation with someone who was clearly not in their right mind. He forced himself to stay calm, stayed awake for the rest of the night, and waited for morning to come. The next day, Sunday, Dan happily moved all of his belongings to his new building. His new roommate was normal, polite, and easy to talk to. They had a great conversation, turned off the lights, and went to bed. But for the third night in a row, Dan was woken up by a strange sound. It was a faint metallic clicking noise coming from the door every 30 seconds. The clicking sound was slow, calculated, and rhythmic, as if the person on the other side was taking their time to avoid making too much noise. Dan crept out of bed and looked through the peephole. The common area outside was brightly lit, and Dan could see the top of a person's head standing right outside their door. The person was looking down, and the tiny clicking noises were coming from the doorknob. The person was slowly trying to unlock the door from the outside. Dan immediately called the campus police, who arrived in less than 5 minutes. The campus police officers were highly professional, asking Dan a series of questions about Dale's behavior and taking notes. When Dan finally opened the door, the officers had Dale in handcuffs. Dan explained everything to the police, telling them how Dale had stalked him to his new building. They took Dale away, and Dan never saw him again. He was either suspended or expelled, and Dan was finally able to enjoy the rest of his college years in peace. Dan got through the rest of his years at college just like anybody else, but the nightmarish experience he had with Dale still pops up in his head every now and then, serving as a dark reminder of his first week at school. For the next story, we travel to Binghamton University, where a student spent 2 years of his academic life. He had quickly made a large, close-knit group of friends, and they would go out and have fun every single weekend. One particular Friday night in October, the group did not have any major plans. Most of their friends were studying or staying in, so the narrator and 2 of his closest friends decided to go hang out in the school nature preserve. It was a crisp, cool Friday night, and the leaves on the trees were starting to change colors and fall to the ground. The preserve was a massive, densely wooded area located on the edge of the campus, featuring a beautiful lake. On the far side of the lake, deep within the trees, there was a small clearing. This spot was perfect for building campfires because it was completely hidden from the view of the main campus and the campus security patrols. Students would occasionally go there to drink, smoke, and hang out away from the strict rules of the dorms. It was a relatively unknown spot, which was exactly why the 3 friends loved it so much. They walked down the narrow, unlit trails of the nature preserve, relying entirely on the small flashlights of their mobile phones to avoid tripping over exposed tree roots. That night, they packed a backpack full of beers, gathered some dry firewood, lit a small campfire, and sat down on some damp logs to hang out. They started having a deep conversation about life, school, and relationships, laughing and enjoying the cool autumn air. As the night went on and the alcohol took effect, they became louder and more relaxed. Eventually, they were laughing so hard at a joke that one of the friends lost his balance and fell onto the forest floor, rolling around in the dry leaves. But right in the middle of their laughter, the other friend suddenly went completely quiet. He held up his hand and whispered for everyone to shut up. The laughter stopped instantly. They all sat in silence, listening closely to the dark woods. Through the crackle of their fire, they heard the distinct sound of dry leaves crunching and branches snapping in the distance. The sound was incredibly distinct. It was not the light, random rustling of a small animal. It was the heavy, rhythmic crunch of someone walking on 2 feet, carefully trying to step quietly. Since they were all under 21, they immediately panicked. Thinking it was the campus police patrolling the woods, they quickly threw their empty beer bottles into the deep lake to hide the evidence and stuffed the rest of the beers back into the narrator's backpack. Because the narrator was moderately drunk, his anxiety was extremely high, and his friends were just as terrified. Their campfire made them completely visible to anyone in the woods, but this spot was so deep and isolated that it was incredibly rare to ever encounter anyone else out there. It sounded like just one person moving around in the dark. Suddenly, a heavy branch snapped very close to them, which freaked them all out. None of them were confrontational, so they did not have the courage to yell out and ask who was there. Instead, they just sat in absolute silence, shushing each other. Then they heard the footsteps start to move. Someone was walking in a wide crescent shape, slowly circling their campsite. It felt like a scene from a horror movie. As the cracking branches and rustling leaves echoed through the dark trees, Out of nowhere, a massive, heavy thud made them all jump. A large wooden branch had been violently thrown from the darkness, landing right in the middle of their campfire, sending sparks flying into the air. The branch had a thick layer of moss and sharp twigs jutting out, landing with such force that it kicked up a cloud of hot ash and glowing red embers. One of the friends completely panicked, stood up, and ran off into the dark woods toward the campus. The narrator and his remaining friend sat there on the ground, shocked and confused, trying to figure out if this was some kind of sick joke. But any doubt they had was instantly shattered when a second branch came flying out of the darkness, striking his friend hard in the face. The friend let out a sharp scream of pure pain. The narrator grabbed his backpack, helped his bleeding friend up, and they both ran as fast as they could through the dark woods in the direction of the dorms. When they finally emerged from the trees and reached the paved road, they stopped to catch their breath. But they immediately heard heavy footsteps rapidly approaching through the thick brush. They realized they were still being followed. They ran all the way back to their dorm building and rushed into their friend's room, where the first friend who had run away was already waiting, pale and shaking. They locked the door and ran to the window, looking down at the woods below. Under the glow of a street lamp, they saw a dark figure pacing back and forth along the edge of the trees, stepping back into the shadows whenever a car passed. Eventually, the figure turned and disappeared back into the deep woods. They never went back to the preserve after dark again. The next incident takes place during the first week of school during freshman year at the University of Iowa. The narrator was just starting to get comfortable with his new roommate, who was determined to join a college fraternity. The official rush week was starting the following week, but the pre-rush parties were already beginning on Thursday of the first week. The roommate did not want to go to these parties alone, because he felt it would be much harder to meet people, so he convinced the narrator to join him. Although the narrator had absolutely no interest in rushing, he agreed to go along as he wanted to experience the famous party culture of the university. On Thursday night, they headed to what was known as one of the lowest-ranked, unrecognized underground fraternities on campus. The house was located far from the main campus in a run-down, sketchy downtown neighborhood. The house was surrounded by cracked sidewalks, overgrown weeds, and piles of empty aluminum cans littered across the front lawn. It looked like a decrepit rental house rather than a real fraternity house. When they arrived, they were greeted at the door by a short, chubby guy in a sweaty white t-shirt holding a red Solo cup, who told them to come inside. The living room was dimly lit, incredibly hot, and packed with about 50 guys. There were only 2 girls in the entire place, and the overall vibe was highly awkward and antisocial. After 20 minutes of painful conversations, the narrator wanted to leave, but a large crowd blocked the front door, so they decided to wait. The narrator drank several cheap beers to pass the time, quickly downing 5 cups before he felt a slight buzz. That was when a heavy-set guy approached him, handed him a small glass bottle, and told him it would get him completely wasted. The heavy-set guy had a sinister smirk on his face, his eyes darting back and forth as if he was waiting for the perfect opportunity. The guy stood there staring at him, waiting for him to drink it, so the narrator took the shot. It was a harsh, burning liquor. The guy kept talking to him, physically blocking him from leaving, and within minutes, the narrator's vision began to blur. He felt incredibly dizzy, and the entire room suddenly faded to black. When he finally woke up, he was completely disoriented. His head was throbbing with a dull pain, and he had no idea how much time had passed. The room was so dark that he could not see his own hand in front of his face at first. He lay perfectly still on the mattress, trying to listen past the loud, muffled bass of the music coming from the floor below. He could hear the muffled music, so he knew he was still inside the house. As his eyes adjusted to the dark, he saw a small closet door. Suddenly, over the loud music, he heard the distinct, terrifying sound of a plastic bag being crinkled from inside the dark closet, as if someone was standing in there watching him and had just shifted their weight. The crinkling noise of the plastic bag inside the small, dark closet was incredibly distinct, and the narrator knew without a doubt that he was not alone in that room. Terrified, the narrator bolted out of the room, ran downstairs, grabbed his roommate, and pushed him out the front door. On the drive back, he told his roommate he had been drugged. He did not feel any pain, and his clothes were intact, so he assumed he had not been assaulted, especially since he had only been unconscious for about 10 minutes. It was a terrifying experience that convinced him to never go near an underground fraternity again. For the final story, we look at a student who had a single dorm room during his sophomore year. The room was tucked away in a quiet, isolated corner of the floor, completely secluded down a private corridor. His single dorm room was located at the very end of a long, dimly lit hallway, requiring a sharp turn into a private alcove that made him feel entirely isolated from the rest of the floor. It was nice because he could still socialize with his floor mates, but have total privacy when needed. A few weeks into the semester, he was sitting at his desk late at night, cramming for a difficult biology exam. The silence was broken by a very soft, faint tapping on his door. He yelled for them to come in, but nothing happened. He got up, opened the door, but the corridor was completely empty. He walked around the corner to the main hallway, but saw no one. He assumed someone was pulling a prank. The next night, after he turned off his lamp to sleep, the tapping returned, but much louder this time, turning into a heavy, deliberate knock. He asked who was there, but the knocking stopped and no one answered. He opened the door quickly, but again, the hall was empty. The next morning he asked his neighbors, but everyone denied doing it. On the third night, he woke up after 3 hours to loud, aggressive pounding on his door. He ran and threw it open, finding no one, but this time, he immediately sprinted down his private hallway. As he turned the corner, he caught a brief glimpse of a figure disappearing around the far end of the hallway. He ran after them and saw a door at the end of the hall shutting. It was the communal bathroom. He pushed the bathroom door open with force. He slowly stepped into the bathroom, the cold tile floor beneath his feet sending a shiver up his spine. The lights were completely off, so he reached out and flipped the switch, flooding the room with bright, sterile fluorescent light. He walked past the sinks, looking at his own pale reflection in the mirror, before slowly walking toward the 2 closed stalls at the back. He walked inside and checked the stalls. He looked under the stall doors and saw a pair of heavy black boots in one of the stalls. He stared down at the black leather boots, noticing the worn soles and the dirty laces resting on the cold white tile floor of the empty stall. He took a deep breath, braced himself, and pushed the stall door open. He was shocked to find the heavy black boots sitting empty on the floor with no one wearing them. Suddenly, a creepy, raspy giggling sound echoed through the bathroom. It did not sound like a college student. It sounded like an old, unstable man laughing to himself. The narrator's courage vanished. Terrified, the narrator ran back to his room, locked the door, and stayed awake all night, ignoring one last round of knocking. He never found out who that person was, but the memory of the empty boots and the laughter still haunts him. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. When you buy your very first home, it is supposed to be one of the most exciting milestones of your entire life. You are finally on your own, starting a fresh chapter and making a space completely your own. For one 24-year-old guy who had just graduated from college and landed a decent paying job, this was a dream come true. He bought a charming house in a quiet neighborhood, and for the first few months, everything seemed absolutely perfect. But this house had a layout that was a bit unusual. It had a massive, incredibly spacious basement that he mostly used for storing extra moving boxes. The previous owners had partitioned the basement into several separate rooms using cheap plywood and exposed wooden studs. There was the main landing area at the bottom of the stairs, then a laundry section, then a room that was probably meant to be a workshop, and finally a dark, dusty back room that was used strictly for storage. It had a strange maze-like quality to it. Because of all the partitions, you could not see the entire basement from any single vantage point. He actually thought this was kind of cool when he first toured the place, but that feeling would change very quickly. Fast forward to a quiet weekday evening. He realized he needed to go downstairs to do a load of laundry, which was really the only time he ever spent any time down there. As he walked toward the basement door, he noticed something slightly unusual. The basement lights were already turned on. He stood there at the top of the stairs for a second, staring at the warm glow spilling out from under the door. He knew he had not been down there in days. but he quickly shrugged it off. He assumed he must have simply forgotten to turn them off the last time he was doing laundry, and he did not want to overthink it. The lighting downstairs was incredibly dim anyway. The previous owners had left an old, yellowing incandescent bulb in the socket, and he had never bothered to replace it. It cast long, creepy shadows across the plywood partitions. He opened the door and began to descend the wooden steps. He made it to the bottom and started walking toward the laundry area. But then, as he neared the washing machine, he caught a sudden movement in his peripheral vision. He stopped in his tracks. Instinctively, he turned his head toward the far corner of the room. Sitting there, crouching low behind a folding plastic table that he had set up near the wall, was a man. The two of them locked eyes. The 24-year-old was completely paralyzed. His mind simply refused to process what he was looking at. There was a dirty, disheveled stranger hiding in his house. The man looked like he had just crawled out of a wet sewer. His clothes were covered in filth, and he had a wild, intense look on his face. For a few agonizing seconds, neither of them moved. They just stood there, staring at each other in the dim yellow light. It was not a friendly stare, it was a look of pure malice. And then the stranger stood up. But instead of running toward the stairs to escape, he bolted deeper into the basement, disappearing behind the plywood partitions toward the dark storage room in the back. That sudden movement finally snapped the young man out of his frozen state of terror. Panic flooded his system. He turned around and began backing up toward the stairs, keeping his eyes glued to the dark corners of the basement. But the problem was, he moved too slowly. Before he could even reach the bottom step, the entire basement plunged into total darkness. The stranger had reached the main breaker, or flipped the light switch. The darkness was absolute. The young man had never experienced his basement without any lights, and he was completely unprepared for how pitch black it would be. He could not even see his own hand in front of his face. He tried to rely on his memory of the room to guide him back to the stairs, but the layout was too confusing. He took a panicked step forward, tripped over a loose box, and crashed heavily onto the hard concrete floor. When he scrambled back to his feet, he was completely disoriented. He had no idea which way he was facing. His heart was hammering against his ribs, and the sheer terror of the situation made it impossible to think clearly. To make matters worse, his phone was sitting on the kitchen counter upstairs, meaning he had no flashlight. In a desperate bid to defend himself, he started screaming at the top of his lungs. He hoped that by acting completely wild and unstable, he might frighten the intruder into staying away from him. But actually, that strategy backfired immediately. Instead of retreating, the intruder started screaming back. The terrifying yells echoed from the other side of the dark basement. It was not a scream of fear. It was a loud, aggressive, deeply intimidating roar. The man sounded like an absolute maniac, completely unhinged and ready to attack. The young man instantly shut his mouth, terrified that the noise was only drawing the intruder closer. As soon as he stopped, the intruder stopped too. The silence that followed was suffocating. The young man began to crawl and grope around in the dark, trying to navigate the maze purely by touch. But as he slid his hands along the dusty plywood walls, he heard the distinct sound of shuffling feet behind him. The stranger was moving too. The sounds of shifting boxes and soft footsteps were getting closer and closer. In that moment of pure horror, the young man realized something deeply unsettling. This stranger seemed to navigate the dark basement much better than he did. He kept moving, praying he would find the wooden stairs. He could hear heavy, ragged breathing somewhere just a few feet behind him. He was certain he was about to be caught and killed in the dark. Then, his hand finally brushed against the wooden base of the staircase. A wave of relief washed over him as he grabbed the handrail and prepared to sprint upward. But as he placed his foot on the second step, a cold, powerful hand clamped tightly around his ankle. The grip was incredibly strong, pulling him backward with immense force. He lost his footing. His head slammed hard against the wooden railing, and he fell backward onto the concrete floor. Even though he could not see his attacker, he could feel himself being dragged away from the stairs. In a desperate bid for survival, he began kicking and thrashing his legs with everything he had. Miraculously, his heel connected solidly with the stranger's face. The man let out a grunt and loosened his grip just enough. The young man twisted his body, broke free, and scrambled back toward the stairs on his hands and knees. The stranger began screaming again, a sound of pure rage. But this time the young man found the steps. He flew up the stairs in the dark, threw himself through the door, and slammed it shut. But the nightmare was not over. The basement door did not have a lock. He had no choice but to throw his entire body weight against the wooden frame. Seconds later, he heard heavy footsteps pounding up the stairs, followed by a violent crash against the other side of the door. The door actually forced open a tiny crack, and it took every ounce of his remaining strength to push it back shut. He kicked off his socks to get better traction on the kitchen floor, pressing his feet firmly against the ground and his back against the door. The intruder slammed into the door again and again, trying to break through. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the slamming stopped. He heard the footsteps retreat back down the stairs. He seized the opportunity, dashed to the counter to grab his phone, and ran back to hold the door shut while dialing the police. When the officers arrived, they searched the entire property, but the intruder was already gone. They found one of the basement windows forced open from the outside. Nothing in the house had been stolen. One of the officers suggested a chilling theory. The stranger had likely been living in the basement for weeks, using it as a secret shelter. That explained how he knew exactly where the light switch was, despite it being in a highly unusual spot. The young man ended up moving out of that house just 4 months later. He could never shake the feeling that if he had not kicked himself free that night, he would not have survived. And so, some basement encounters are not just about sudden attacks. Sometimes they are about the slow, agonizing realization that you are being watched by someone hiding in the dark. This next story happened almost 20 years ago when a boy was just 14 years old. His parents had to drive out of state to attend a weekend wedding. They did not want to leave him completely alone, even though he was old enough to look after himself for a couple of days. The original plan was for his older sister, who was already in college and lived about an hour away, to come over and stay at the house with him. But almost as soon as their parents drove out of the driveway, his sister sent him a text message. She told him that a massive party had just come up, and she was not going to make it. The 14-year-old did not really care. In fact, he was kind of excited to have the whole house to himself. He decided not to tell his parents because he did not want to worry them, and he certainly did not want them scrambling to find another adult to watch him. Besides, they lived in a very safe, quiet suburban neighborhood. The street was lined with neat 2-story homes and young families. There was absolutely no reason to worry. The evening started out completely normal. He spent nearly 6 hours straight playing video games on the living room television, enjoying the freedom of not having his parents tell him to turn off the console. It was a peaceful night, right up until shortly after midnight. He was lounging on the couch, half asleep, when he heard a faint, rhythmic tapping sound. It seemed to be coming from the backyard. He figured it was just a loose tree branch or some debris hitting the vinyl siding of the house. He ignored it and went back to his game. But a few minutes later, the tapping started again. This time, it seemed to move. It was the exact same sound, but it was migrating slowly along the side of the house. That was when he began to feel a little uneasy. A tree branch does not walk along the side of a building. The sound was too consistent, too deliberate to be caused by the wind. He muted the television and sat completely frozen, straining his ears to listen. The house fell into a heavy, tense silence. After a minute of hearing nothing else, he tried to convince himself that it was probably just a raccoon or a stray cat climbing on the roof. He unmuted the television and tried to relax. Then, 20 minutes later, a new sound echoed through the house. This one made his heart drop. It was another tapping noise, but this time it was coming from directly beneath him. The living room was situated right above an unfinished basement. The basement was mostly used for storage, containing a small, outdated kitchenette in one corner. He muted the television once more, his hands starting to shake. He knew he had to investigate, if only to reassure himself that some wild animal had not crawled inside. He walked slowly toward the basement door. He tried to tell himself that a raccoon had probably climbed through one of the ground-level windows and was now knocking against the glass. He opened the door and stood at the top of the stairs, looking down into the yawning black void below. The tapping was much louder now, occurring every few seconds. In a moment of nervous desperation, He called out a soft hello into the dark. The tapping stopped instantly. That reaction chilled him to the bone. If it had been a wild animal, the sound of his voice would have caused it to scurry away or make some kind of noise. But instead, there was only dead silence. He realized that whatever was down there was listening to him. He desperately wanted to turn on the basement lights, but the switch was located all the way at the bottom of the stairs. There was absolutely no way he was going to walk down into the dark to flip it. Instead, he came up with a clever but terrifying plan. He pulled out his cell phone, which was an old model with a built-in camera and a bright flash. He gently pushed the basement door open just a tiny crack, enough to slide his hand through. He aimed the phone's camera toward the far side of the room, where the windows and the kitchenette were located. He closed his eyes, pressed the record button, and let the camera capture a few seconds of footage with the flash constantly firing. Then, he quickly pulled his hand back, slammed the door, and locked it. He stood in the hallway, his chest heaving as he opened the video file on his phone screen. The footage was incredibly grainy and low resolution, but as the flash illuminated the dark room on his screen, he froze. Standing directly underneath one of the small basement windows, right inside his house, was a tall, dark figure of a person. A scream escaped his throat before he could stop it. He bolted up the stairs to his bedroom, slammed the door, locked it, and immediately called his father. His father, realizing the gravity of the situation, stayed on the line with him while using another phone to call the local police. While he was waiting on the line, crying and trembling, he heard a sudden, violent banging sound coming from downstairs. The intruder was trying to break through the locked basement door to get into the main part of the house. He heard 5 or 6 heavy, metallic thuds as the person threw their weight against the wood. Then, abruptly, the banging stopped. The house went silent again. A few minutes later, flashing blue lights illuminated his bedroom window. The police had arrived. They searched the entire basement, but the intruder had already escaped back through the ground-level window. They searched the backyard and the surrounding neighborhood, but they found no trace of the suspect. When the officers went downstairs to document the scene, they noticed several items had been moved or stolen. But the most horrifying discovery was in the small kitchenette. The police pointed out that the largest, sharpest knife from the knife block on the counter was missing. The realization was absolutely terrifying. If he had gone down those stairs to flip the light switch, or if he had not locked that door, he would have walked straight into an armed intruder. He never found out who the man was, and the police were never able to make an arrest. The grainy video on his old phone was the only proof that the nightmare had actually happened. But the problem was, even when you think you are totally safe in your own home with friends, the layout of a house can work against you. This next story happened to a 16-year-old boy about 4 years ago. He lived with his parents in a massive suburban home that they had purchased before he was born. The house looked perfectly normal from the street, but the interior had some very strange architectural quirks. The oddest feature was the basement, which was easily the largest room in the entire house. His parents had finished the basement years earlier, transforming it into a cozy, casual hangout space. It had a large sectional couch, a big television, and 2 deep storage rooms located in the back. Because his parents preferred to hang out in the living room upstairs, the basement essentially became his personal apartment. He spent almost all of his free time down there. He also had a very friendly, highly energetic cat named Rocky. Rocky was the type of cat that constantly demanded attention, scratching at doors and meowing at all hours of the night. To prevent the cat from waking them up, his parents had a strict routine of putting Rocky in the basement every single night before they went to sleep. The basement also had an interior door that led directly into the garage. While his parents used it for carrying in heavy bags of groceries, the 16-year-old used it for a very different purpose. It was the perfect stealthy route for sneaking his friends into the house without his parents knowing. One Friday night, he had invited a girl named Malene over to hang out. They were sitting on the sectional couch, watching a movie and talking. At some point during the night, he heard a faint rustling sound coming from one of the dark storage rooms in the back. He did not think anything of it. He assumed his parents had already put Rocky down in the basement for the night, and that the cat was simply rummaging through some old cardboard boxes. It was the exact kind of soft, scratching sound a cat would make. Malene seemed to tense up a bit when she heard it, but he quickly smiled and assured her that it was just his cat playing in the storage room. They went back to watching their movie, but the noises did not stop. Every few minutes, there would be another soft rustle or a heavy thud from the back of the room. Malene kept glancing nervously over her shoulder toward the dark hallway that led to the storage rooms. Each time he had to reassure her, explaining that Rocky was an incredibly active cat who loved to climb on top of the storage shelves. He was completely calm, convinced that there was a perfectly logical explanation for the noises. But then he heard a sound that made his stomach sink. It was a sharp, frantic scratching sound. But it was not coming from the storage rooms in the back of the basement. It was coming from the closed wooden door at the very top of the basement stairs, the door that led to the kitchen upstairs. He knew that sound anywhere. It was Rocky. The cat was upstairs, scratching at the door, trying to get down into the basement. A cold wave of dread washed over him. If Rocky was upstairs behind a closed door, then whatever had been rustling and thudding in the dark storage room for the last half hour was absolutely not a cat. He sat frozen on the couch, his mind racing as he tried to figure out what to do. He did not want to panic Malene, but before he could even utter a word, Malene let out a blood-curdling scream. He whipped his head around. Malene was pointing a trembling finger toward the dark hallway at the back of the basement. He looked and his heart stopped. A small, bright neon foam football was slowly rolling across the carpet. It had just been tossed out from the pitch-black opening of the storage room. Someone was hiding in the darkness of the storage closet, watching them, and had deliberately thrown the toy out into the room. Without a single second of hesitation, the boy grabbed Malene's arm, dragged her off the couch, and bolted up the wooden stairs. They burst through the door, slamming it shut behind them, leaving Rocky safe in the hallway. Malene was hysterical, crying and shaking from the sheer terror of the moment. The boy was trembling so hard he could barely stand. His parents rushed out of their bedroom, realized something was terribly wrong, and immediately called the police. Within minutes, several patrol cars arrived at the house. The boy went out onto the back deck, keeping his eyes glued to the garage door. He knew that the basement had an interior door leading to the garage, and if the intruder tried to escape that way, he would see them. The police officers spent nearly an hour searching every single corner of the basement and the garage. But when they came back upstairs, they had some confusing news. They had found absolutely no one. There were no signs of forced entry, and every single basement window was securely locked from the inside. One of the officers suggested that the intruder must have slipped out through the garage door just before the police arrived, but the boy knew that was impossible. He had been watching the only exit from the garage the entire time, and no one had walked out. To this day, his family has never gotten a clear answer. His parents believe the intruder simply managed to slip away unseen, but the boy remains convinced that whoever threw that football was still hiding somewhere inside the house, or had found a way out that no one else knew about. The mystery has never been solved, and he still cannot look at a basement storage room without feeling a chill run down his spine. It turns out that some basement secrets are kept not just by strangers, but by your own family. This final story begins when a boy was just 9 years old, growing up in a classic suburban family home. Like almost every young kid, he was absolutely terrified of the basement. It was a dark, cold, and unwelcoming place. But he had a major dilemma. The basement was the only place in the house where his parents kept their video game consoles. If he wanted to play, he had to brave the darkness. On the weekends, he loved to stay up late, sitting close to the screen and playing his favorite game, Driver 2, on the original PlayStation. It was an incredibly difficult game for a 9-year-old, and he spent countless hours trying to beat the final levels. He usually tried to finish his gaming sessions before his parents went to sleep. As long as he could hear the muffled sounds of the television upstairs, or the quiet voices of his mom and dad in the living room, he felt safe. He knew that if anything happened, a quick run up the stairs would bring him to safety, but the basement had a particularly terrifying section. Tucked away in a dark corner was the laundry and boiler room. This room had absolutely no windows, making it pitch black at all hours of the day. It was filled with old creaking pipes and a loud, rumbling water heater that constantly made strange, sudden noises. The heavy wooden door to the laundry room was always kept shut, but the boy would often pause his game, staring at the closed door, convinced he could hear something moving around inside. One late Friday night, he was sitting on the floor in front of the television, completely absorbed in his game. Suddenly, the silence of the basement was broken by a slow, heavy creaking sound. He slowly turned his head. The door to the pitch-black laundry room was swinging wide open. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He stared into the dark opening, waiting for something to happen. Then, a sound emerged from the darkness. It was a low, ghostly groan, a soft, sorrowful wailing sound. But as he listened closer, he recognized the voice. It sounded exactly like his mother. The boy let out a nervous laugh, feeling a sudden wave of relief. He assumed his mom had quietly snuck down the stairs while he was distracted by his game and was playing a silly prank to scare him. He stood up and called out, telling her that it was a nice try. But she had not fooled him. His mother had never been the type of person to play practical jokes. But in his mind, it was the only logical explanation. He walked confidently toward the open doorway of the laundry room, expecting his mother to jump out and laugh. He stopped right at the threshold, peering into the absolute blackness of the room. The groaning had stopped. As his eyes adjusted to the dark, he saw a tall outline of a person standing perfectly still in the center of the room. He took another step forward, calling out to her again, but this time his voice was trembling. He reached the edge of the darkness, and as he got closer, his eyes finally registered the figure's face. It was not his mother. The person standing in the pitch-black room was a strange, disheveled woman, with wide, vacant eyes and a twisted expression on her face. She was staring directly at him, completely motionless. The boy let out a horrific scream, spun around, and ran up the stairs as fast as his legs could carry him. He burst into the living room, crying and hyperventilating. To his shock, his mother and father were both sitting right there on the couch, watching television. They had not been downstairs at all. They instantly stood up, alarmed by his blood-curdling screams. The boy pointed frantically toward the basement door, sobbing that there was a strange woman hiding in the laundry room. His parents exchanged a long, panicked look. Without saying a word to him, they both rushed down the basement stairs, slamming the heavy door shut behind them. The boy sat on the living room floor for what felt like hours, crying and confused. Eventually, his mother came back upstairs. Her face was pale, and she looked exhausted. She gently told him that everything was fine, but that he needed to go straight to his bedroom and go to sleep. He was too terrified to ask questions, so he simply obeyed. The next morning, his parents sat him down at the kitchen table. They told him that the entire incident had been a big joke. They claimed they had asked one of their old friends to sneak into the house and play a prank on him, to teach him a lesson about staying up too late. They treated the whole thing like a light-hearted laugh, but the boy could tell their smiles were forced. When he asked who the woman was, his mother claimed she was an old friend from out of state named Debbie, who was visiting for the weekend. The boy tried to accept their explanation, but as the years went by, the story began to fall apart. Whenever he brought up the name Debbie, his parents would look incredibly nervous and quickly change the subject. Sometimes they would give conflicting stories about who she was, or claim they had forgotten the incident entirely. When he was 14 years old, he decided he had to find the truth. He waited until his father was asleep, quietly took his credit card from his wallet, and signed up for an online genealogy and public records search engine. He typed in his parents' names and began scanning through their family trees. Among the list of names, one entry stopped him cold. His mother had a sister named Debbie. He quickly searched his aunt's name online, and a local newspaper obituary popped up. She had passed away several years ago, but the timeline matched. He printed out the documents, walked straight into the living room where his parents were sitting, and demanded an explanation. His parents stared at the screen in complete shock. The room went silent. Finally, his dad looked at his mom and told her that it was time to tell him the truth. His mother broke down and confessed everything. The woman in the basement had indeed been her sister Debbie, but she was not a visiting friend, and it had not been a prank. Debbie suffered from severe, untreated mental illness and had a history of violent behavior. She had harmed several people in the past, and his parents had made a strict decision to keep her completely away from their son to protect him. But on that Friday night, Debbie had somehow managed to sneak into their house undetected. She had slipped through an unlocked door and hidden in the dark boiler room, waiting. If the boy had not run away when he did, there was no telling what she might have done to him. His parents had rushed downstairs, confronted her, and quietly removed her from the property, fabricating the entire prank story to prevent him from being traumatized. The boy was stunned. He realized that the sister his mother had kept secret for his entire life had been standing just inches away from him in the dark, armed with who knows what, ready to do harm. Even now, as an adult, he is haunted by the memory of those hollow eyes staring at him from the dark laundry room. He still wonders what his parents were truly hiding, and what would have happened if he had taken just one more step into the darkness. Basements are places where we store our old belongings, our unwanted junk, and the things we want to keep out of sight. But sometimes, they are also where the most terrifying secrets are kept, waiting in the pitch black for the lights to go out. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Imagine a job where you drive to unknown locations, knocking on doors of complete strangers in the pitch black of night. For most people, delivering pizzas is just a simple way to make some extra cash. You listen to music, drive around, and hand over a warm box for a decent tip. But sometimes, a routine delivery turns into a nightmare that you can never escape. It was a late Friday night in Saugerties. A 21-year-old young man was working the closing shift at John's Pizza. Around 9 o'clock, just an hour before closing, a call came in for a delivery in the next town over. The drive was about 15 minutes down an isolated road that seemed to lead to absolutely nothing. But he kept going anyway. Eventually, the road led to a massive house sitting right by the water. Every light in the house was turned on, and music was blasting from inside. But when he parked, he noticed something unusual. There were only 2 cars in the driveway. Walking up to the entrance of the brand new house, he rang the doorbell several times because the music inside was absolutely deafening. The door swung open, and 2 young women, one blonde and one brunette, stood there barely clothed with massive, flirty grins. The blonde woman grabbed the pizza, while the brunette handed him a $20 bill. She looked him up and down, told him he was cute, and asked for his phone number. He quickly gave it to her, hoping to get himself invited inside. The blonde woman immediately told him to come on in. But the second he stepped inside, his excitement vanished. A highly unpleasant, rotting odor hit him right in the face. The massive foyer was completely empty. There were no other party guests, just the empty house and the blasting music. The 2 women began leading him toward the staircase. He followed them, but he felt a knot forming in his stomach. He was on the 2nd step when a sound echoed through the house that made his blood run cold. It was a loud, horrifying scream for help coming from upstairs. He froze and looked at the women. Their flirty expressions had completely disappeared. Their faces were dead serious. He watched in horror as the blonde woman looked directly at the brunette, and very clearly mouthed a single word. She mouthed the word shit. The young man did not ask questions. His survival instinct took over. He spun around, ran out the front door, and bolted to his car. He started the engine, threw the car into reverse, and tore down the long driveway. Turning onto the main road, he looked up at his rearview mirror. In each and every window of that house, there were heads peering out. Multiple people were standing in the darkness of the windows, silently watching him drive away. It had been an ambush. He immediately dialed the police. An hour later, an investigator called him back to report that they had raided the house, but it was completely empty. Whoever had been there had abandoned the property in a massive hurry. The house was vacant and up for sale. Later that night, his phone buzzed with a text message. "We know where you work." He was so terrified that he quit his job the next day. The police came to his house to ask questions about the scream, but he changed his number and moved on, trying to find some peace of mind. But as terrifying as that was, another delivery driver experienced something even more direct and physical. This young man worked for Domino's Pizza, and it was his last delivery of the night to a house about 10 minutes away. When he pulled up, the house was incredibly dark. He grabbed the pizza, walked up to the porch and rang the bell. Nobody answered, but as he stood there, he noticed a handwritten note taped to the door. The note read, "To Pizza Guy, please let yourself in and leave the pizza in the upstairs bedroom. The money will be on the bed." Immediately, red flags began popping up in his mind. He called his boss back at the shop, explaining that he did not feel safe going inside. But his boss was completely unsympathetic. He told the driver that he had to complete the delivery and was absolutely not allowed to bring that pizza back. With no other choice, the driver turned the doorknob. It was unlocked. He stepped into the house. The only source of light was a tiny candle nightlight on the wall, providing just enough dim light to see his way toward the staircase. He slowly walked up the stairs, his heart pounding. When he reached the second floor, he found himself in a small dark hallway. There were two doors at the end. One door was wide open, and the other was tightly shut. The open door led into a pitch-black room. He assumed this had to be the bedroom mentioned in the note. He stood at the threshold, shaking. He pushed the door open and reached his hand along the wall, searching for a light switch. He found it and flipped it, but the lights did not work. He stepped into the dark room, taking slow steps until his leg bumped against the bed. He set the pizza down and began searching for the money. Right then, he heard a faint shuffling sound coming from just outside the bedroom door. He froze, listening. Hoping it was just an elderly resident, he searched faster. He grabbed the money, stuffed it into his pocket, and walked out. But when he stepped back into the hallway, the door to the second room, which had been tightly shut when he walked in, was now wide open. He felt a wave of pure panic. He called out, "Your pizza is on the bed, have a great day." There was no response. He began to lean toward the dark room, trying to get a view inside. It was far too dark. He reached his hand inside, feeling along the wall for a light switch. Suddenly, a hand shot out of the darkness. Someone grabbed his arm with a tight grip and began pulling him into the pitch-black room. The driver screamed, raised his other hand, and began jabbing his car keys repeatedly into the attacker's arm. The grip suddenly loosened. The driver tore his arm free and bolted down the stairs. He ran out of the house, jumped into his car, and drove away. When he got back to the shop, he confronted his boss and showed him his bruised arm. He managed to leverage the terrifying experience to get a pay raise from $7.50 to $8.50 an hour. His boss begged him not to call the police. In hindsight, the driver realized he should have called them anyway, but at the time, he was just glad to survive. And then, there are the deliveries that take you deep into the woods, where there is no phone reception, no streetlights, and absolutely no one to hear you scream. Another young man was working at Gino's Pizzeria. He was covering a shift for a sick coworker on a slow Tuesday night. He was driving his manual 1998 Ford Mustang, which was a massive gas guzzler. He completed 3 normal deliveries over the first 3 hours. The shop closed at 9, so he figured he had only 1 more delivery left. Then the phone rang. He was greeted by a woman who sounded heavily intoxicated. Her voice was raspy. She stuttered, and there were long, awkward silences. It took a massive effort just to get her address because she kept asking someone in the background for it. After finally giving him the details, she hung up. He told the chef, whose name was Mario, to make 1 regular pizza. 10 minutes later, he was in his Mustang, driving down a dark, winding gravel road through the deep woods. Finally, he reached the destination. It was a dark trailer home. All the lights inside were completely turned off. But as he pulled up, he could see the orange glow of a fire coming from the backyard. He could also hear a woman yelling angrily at someone. He turned off the engine, grabbed the pizza, and stepped out of his car. As he shut the door, he looked up at the trailer. He saw the window curtains move. Someone was standing in the pitch black watching him. He decided to walk around to the backyard where the fire was and called out. Instantly, a disheveled man and woman spun around. The woman asked what the delivery boy was doing there, and the man snapped at her, saying she was the one who gave the address. The young man noticed that they were standing very close together, actively trying to hide something behind their backs. He awkwardly asked if he should go back to the front door. The couple whispered something to each other, and then the woman pointed at him, telling him to wait right there while she went inside to get the money. She disappeared inside. For the next 2 minutes, the driver stood there in the flickering glow of the fire. The husband stood completely still, staring at him with a menacing glare. Finally, the woman came back outside. She handed her husband some cash and whispered in his ear. The husband began counting the money incredibly slowly, drawing out the process on purpose. The driver kept his eyes locked on the woman. Suddenly, she looked past his shoulder, staring into the pitch-black woods behind him. She gave a slow, deliberate nod of her head. The driver immediately sensed the danger. He spun around and looked into the dark tree line. Emerging from the shadows was a massive man, and in his hands he was carrying a heavy axe. He was marching directly toward the driver. With no time to think, the driver reacted on pure instinct. He hoisted the heavy pizza box and flung it with all his might directly at the armed man's face. The box hit him, momentarily disorienting him. The driver did not wait to see the results. He bolted toward his Mustang, jumped inside, started the engine, and tore down the gravel road as fast as the car could go. He made it back to safety and never returned to the shop that night. When Mario the chef texted him to ask what happened, the driver told him about the ambush and the man with the axe. Mario simply replied, "Holy shit." That was the very last time the young man ever delivered a pizza, realizing that in the isolated corners of the world, a simple delivery can easily become a matter of life and death. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. There is a highly unsettling feeling that comes with being completely alone in a house that is surrounded by miles and miles of empty land. For a young woman and her boyfriend, this exact feeling became an absolute reality one Saturday night a few years ago. The boyfriend's parents owned a very successful landscaping company, and because of their business success, they had built a massive, gorgeous home situated right in the middle of nowhere. The property was so vast that if you stepped out of the back door, you could just keep walking for miles in any direction, and you would still be standing on their land. It was the absolute definition of isolated. The long driveway leading up to the main house was unpaved and winding, cutting through dense patches of trees before finally opening up to the main estate. When his parents announced they were going to be out of town for the weekend, the boyfriend asked her if she wanted to come over and stay the night on Saturday, so it could be just the two of them. He thought it would be a great opportunity for them to have some quiet time together. She agreed, though she did mention to him that the sheer size and absolute seclusion of the house made her a little nervous. It was just so dark out there, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. But once she arrived and they settled in, those nervous thoughts started to fade away. Her boyfriend made a wonderful dinner, opened her favorite bottle of wine, and even brought out their favorite card game, Phase 10. They spent hours sitting at the wooden dining table, laughing, playing cards, and just enjoying each other's company. It was a perfect evening, and she actually felt a little sad that it was only going to last for one night. By the time they finished playing, it was around 1 o'clock in the morning. They decided to head into the living room and put on a movie. They were both exhausted from the long week, and it did not take long for them to both drift off to sleep on the comfortable leather couch while the television screen flickered in the dark. That was when their perfect night took a sudden and terrifying turn. Both of them were abruptly jolted awake by an incredibly loud noise. It was so intense and high in volume that they both immediately covered their ears in pain. The sound was actually vibrating through the floorboards, and she could hear the glasses inside the kitchen, china cabinet shaking and rattling against one another. For a split second, she genuinely believed they were experiencing a massive earthquake, even though they lived in an area where earthquakes were practically unheard of. The sound itself was incredibly hard to describe. It was a deep, low-frequency blaring noise, almost like a massive foghorn you would hear on a large cargo ship, but the bass was far lower and the volume was multiplied tenfold. This deafening noise blasted through the house for several long seconds, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Because of how jarring and unexpected the sound was, those few seconds felt like an eternity. Her boyfriend immediately stood up, looking around the room in absolute confusion. They both had the exact same reaction. This was not a normal sound, and there was absolutely nothing nearby that could have produced it. Her boyfriend walked over to the television and turned it off, plunging the room into a heavy silence. He then made his way over to the giant bay window in the living room, which looked out over the massive empty field in the backyard. He pressed his face close to the glass, squinting into the darkness, but he told her he could not see a single thing. She got up from the couch, walked over to join him, and cupped her hands around her eyes to block out the internal room reflection. She scanned the dark yard as best as she could, but the field was just a massive void of blackness. They stood there, whispering, trying to come up with some kind of logical explanation. She even suggested that maybe a large tractor trailer had driven by on a distant road and blasted a custom horn, even though she knew deep down how ridiculous that sounded. As they stood there trying to catch their breath and calm their racing hearts, a sudden bright flash of light illuminated the entire backyard. It was not a small flash like a camera. It was a massive blinding flash of white light, like a bolt of lightning, and it was so bright that it completely lit up the dark living room. They both gasped and pressed themselves against the window again, but once more the yard was completely empty. There was no thunder, no storm clouds, and no rain. The sky was perfectly clear. At this point, the uneasy feeling turned into genuine panic. Her boyfriend decided that they needed to turn off every single light in the house so they could see outside better without being seen themselves. She was terrified of sitting in the pitch-black house, but she knew his logic made sense, so she agreed. They quietly moved into the kitchen, which sat on the side of the house, and began looking out of the side windows. As they stood there in the dark, they suddenly saw a glow of light coming from the rear of the property. They quickly hurried back to the living room and realized that the main motion-activated floodlight in the backyard had just turned on. Her boyfriend froze. He knew that the sensor on that specific floodlight was set up in a way that small woodland animals would not trigger it. Something substantial had to be moving out there. She asked him if he was playing some kind of joke on her, but when she looked at his face, she could see that he was completely pale. He was genuinely terrified. And then, a sound began to drift through the walls. It was a low, strange noise that she had never heard in her entire life. It sounded like whispering, but it was not in any language she recognized. It was a bizarre, rapid mumbling, almost like multiple voices talking over one another in a low, gravelly register. She looked at her boyfriend and whispered that someone was definitely outside the house. He did not reply. He just stared at her with wide, terrified eyes. Before either of them could make another move, her boyfriend pointed a trembling finger at one of the windows on the side of the house. Through the thin blinds, they saw the distinct silhouettes of two people walking by. But their movement was wrong. They were not walking normally. Instead, they seemed to be swaying and gliding past the window in a highly unnatural fluid motion. She grabbed his arm and begged him to call the police. He pulled out his cell phone, but there was no signal. He checked the home's Wi-Fi connection, but that was completely dead too. This was a major red flag because he had never experienced a lack of service at this house before. She pulled out her own phone, and her screen also showed 0 bars. They were completely cut off from the outside world. Suddenly, they heard a metallic rattling sound. Whatever those figures were, they had moved to the side door right next to the kitchen. The handle was turning. She knew for a fact that they had locked that door earlier in the evening, but hearing someone actively try to force their way inside was too much for her to bear. She lost control and began to scream at the top of her lungs. It probably was not the smartest thing to do, but it was pure survival instinct. The sudden screaming seemed to startle whatever was on the other side of the door because the rattling immediately stopped. However, the terror did not end there. Through the glass panels, they could still see the dark shadows of the two figures just standing perfectly still on the porch. The strange, mumbled whispering started up again, vibrating through the wood of the door. Her boyfriend, trying to sound brave, yelled out as loudly as he could that he had a gun and that they had better get off his property immediately. This was a complete lie, but he hoped the threat of violence would scare them away. Instead of a response, the air in the room suddenly grew incredibly heavy, and without any warning, that deafening low-frequency horn sound blasted through the night again. It was even louder this time, echoing off the walls and causing both of them to drop to their knees, covering their ears and screaming in agony. The vibration was so intense it felt like the house was going to collapse. After a few agonizing seconds, the sound vanished, They slowly looked up. The shadows on the porch were gone. A massive flash of white light exploded outside, and almost instantly, both of their cell phones lit up with a barrage of delayed notifications. Their service was back. But before they could even process this, a loud bang echoed through the house. The locked side kitchen door and the locked front door both blew wide open at the exact same time, as if kicked inward by an invisible force. She screamed, expecting some kind of intruders to rush into the house, but nothing did. Her boyfriend ran to both entryways, slammed the doors shut, and locked them. She immediately dialed 911, crying as she explained to the dispatcher that 2 people had tried to break in and that they were using some kind of massive, high-powered horn. It took the police a long time to navigate the rural roads to reach the secluded property. During that wait, the couple stood in the center of the house, clutching each other, terrified that the figures would return. When a sheriff's deputy finally arrived, he listened to their story with a heavy dose of skepticism. He could not comprehend how a noise that loud could occur without any neighbors hearing it, and he pointed out that the backyard was incredibly muddy from recent rains. Yet, when he shone his flashlight around the perimeter of the house and the side door, there were absolutely no muddy footprints, no scuff marks, and no physical evidence that anyone had been standing there. The deputy eventually left, telling them to call back if anything else happened. They spent the rest of the night wide awake, sitting in the living room with all the lights turned on, staring at the locked doors. Nothing else happened that night, and according to her boyfriend and his family, nothing like that ever occurred on the property again. To this day, she still struggles to make sense of what they witnessed, caught between the terrifying reality of what they experienced and the complete lack of physical evidence left behind. It is hard to say what exactly happened on that property, but the complete lack of physical evidence despite the heavy mud made the entire situation feel almost dreamlike to the couple. But the psychological impact was very real, and she notes that she has never looked at the quiet countryside the same way again. The sheer helplessness of being disconnected, of having your technology fail right when you need it most, is a common thread that connects many of these strange accounts. And that brings us to another incredibly strange incident that took place just last year, involving a man who sought peace in isolation, only to find himself facing something completely unexplainable. This man had recently gone through an incredibly painful and messy breakup with his fiancée. They had spent years together building a life, but the relationship had slowly deteriorated into a toxic cycle of resentment. Instead of staying in their shared home and enduring endless, exhausting arguments over their belongings, he decided to make a clean break. He packed up his personal items, loaded his black Labrador retriever named Zemo into his car, and decided to give the house to his ex-fiancée. He just wanted to escape the drama and start the next chapter of his life. Fortunately, his parents owned a small camp house located on the shores of one of the largest lakes in the region. It was a beautiful little property, but because the local climate was cold and miserable for 9 or 10 months out of the year, his parents only ever used the cabin during the peak summer months. Since it was only March, the cabin was completely empty and locked up. Because he primarily worked from home, he called his parents and asked if he could stay there for a while. They were incredibly supportive and told him he could stay as long as he needed. He made sure the electricity and the wireless internet were fully functional, and then he moved in. At first, his friends and family were deeply concerned about him. They worried that isolating himself in a remote lake cabin in the dead of winter would make him lonely and depressed. But to his surprise, he was actually incredibly happy there. The absolute silence of the lake, the crisp spring air, and the company of his loyal dog Zemo were exactly what he needed to heal. Zemo was an energetic, happy dog who usually spent every waking second begging to go outside. There were absolutely no neighbors around at that time of year, making the entire area feel like his own private sanctuary. He had been living peacefully at the cabin for about 2 or 3 weeks when the strange occurrences began. The very first sign that something was off happened on a particularly cold night. He stood by the back door and called for Zemo to go outside to do his business. Normally, being a Labrador, Zemo absolutely loved being outdoors regardless of how freezing or wet the weather was. But this night, the dog refused to budge. When called, Zemo would walk up to the threshold, freeze, and then let out a low, pathetic whimper, backing away into the living room. This was completely out of character for him. Thinking the dog was just being stubborn, the man decided to step out onto the back deck himself to show Zemo that it was safe. As he stepped out into the cold night air, his eyes were immediately drawn to the horizon of the lake. Because the lake was so incredibly massive, you could not see the opposite shoreline in the dark. It was just a vast black void. But on this night, the horizon was alive with several glowing balls of light. These lights were moving in bizarre geometric patterns, darting left and right, rising and falling in ways that defied the physics of any traditional aircraft. He was not immediately frightened. Instead, he was absolutely transfixed. He stood on the deck, watching the lights dance across the sky. His initial thought was that someone must be operating high-end drones over the water, but the sheer number of lights and the incredible speed at which they moved made that theory seem highly improbable. There had to be dozens of them. Suddenly, as he watched, the lights stopped their erratic movement. In the blink of an eye, they all shot straight up into the night sky at an impossible speed and completely vanished from sight. The moment the sky went dark again, Zemo walked calmly out onto the deck, completely relaxed as if the danger had passed. The man went to bed that night with his mind racing, trying to find a logical explanation for what he had just seen. He searched online for similar sightings, but found nothing that matched the strange behavior of those lights. The next morning, he called his father and asked if he had ever witnessed any strange lights or military testing over the lake during his decades of staying there. His father laughed and said he had seen a few shooting stars over the years, but absolutely nothing like what his son was describing. His father suggested it might have been a rare atmospheric phenomenon, like ball lightning or some kind of unusual weather reflection. The man wanted to believe this explanation, so he decided to put it out of his mind and go about his day. But that comfort was incredibly short-lived. That night, at almost the exact same hour, he heard Zemo crying by the back door again. He hurried over, opened the door, and looked out. The lights were back. But this time they were much closer to his property than they had been the night before. An uncomfortable, heavy sensation settled in his chest. The way these balls of light moved was so deliberate and controlled that there was no way it was a natural weather phenomenon. It felt deeply unnatural, almost intelligent. As he watched, some of the lights shot straight up into the atmosphere and disappeared, just like the previous night. However, several of the lights remained, hovering completely still just above the surface of the dark water. They began to blink in a slow, rhythmic pattern, growing brighter and more defined. Then, they began to slowly drift toward one another. He watched in utter disbelief as the individual spheres of light literally merged together, combining one by one until they formed a single, massive glowing orb hovering silently over the lake. The sheer impossibility of what he was witnessing made him feel lightheaded. The giant orb hung there for a few moments, and then, instead of shooting into the sky, it slowly dipped downward, disappearing beneath the horizon line. Because of the absolute darkness, he could not tell if the object had actually submerged into the depths of the lake, or if it had simply moved past the curve of the horizon. But the lights were gone. Once again, Zemo immediately calmed down and went about his business. The man was now thoroughly terrified. He spent the entire night pacing the cabin, looking out the windows, too afraid to close his eyes. He wanted to tell someone, but he knew how crazy it would sound. If he told his friends he was seeing glowing, merging spheres of light over the empty lake, they would assume he was having a psychological breakdown from the stress of his breakup. He spent the next day obsessively searching the internet for UFO or UAP sightings in the area, but the only videos he found were posted on highly questionable websites by people he would normally mock. Now he realized the joke was on him. When night fell again, he seriously considered packing his bags and driving to his parents' house. But a part of him was driven by a morbid curiosity. He needed to know if it was going to happen again. Right on schedule, at the exact same time, the lights appeared. This time he actually saw them manifest. They did not fly in from the distance. They literally just popped into existence in the sky, as if a switch had been flipped. But this night was different. Instead of darting around rapidly, the lights moved in a slow, synchronized manner. One light would glide forward, then stop, and then another would follow. It was a highly coordinated movement, and to his horror, he realized they were heading directly toward his shoreline. As they drew closer, a faint, low-pitched humming sound began to echo through the quiet air. It sounded exactly like the physical hum of an old fluorescent light bulb. Vibrating with electrical energy, the lights were now close enough that he could see they were perfect, solid spheres of pure luminosity, casting a bright glow onto the surface of the water. Panic seized him. He stepped back into the cabin, slid the heavy glass door shut and locked it, but he could not force himself to look away. When the lights reached his backyard, their slow movement suddenly shattered. They became incredibly erratic, shooting off in random directions. They zipped across his lawn, slammed into the siding of his house, zipped through the branches of the nearby pine trees, and dove into the shallow water near his dock. It looked as if his entire property was being bombarded by silent, glowing fireworks. He collapsed to the floor, grabbing Zemo and covering his face, waiting for the impact of shattered glass or fire. But as he lay there, he noticed that Zemo had stopped whimpering. He slowly opened his eyes and looked around. The backyard was completely dark. The lights were gone. He crept over to the glass door and stepped outside with a flashlight, expecting to see scorched earth, broken branches, or damage to his home. But there was absolutely nothing. There was not a single scratch on the house, no burnt leaves, and no physical trace that anything had ever been there. The lights never returned for the rest of his stay at the cabin, leaving him with a deep, lingering confusion that he still carries to this day. He remains anonymous to this day, still living with the quiet burden of knowing that something came to the edge of his parents' property that night, played with the very laws of physics, and then vanished back into the depths of the lake, as if it were nothing. It makes you wonder how many other lakeside cabins sit empty in the colder months, hosting visitors that the owners will never know about. While some unexplainable events occur near water or remote houses, others take place deep within the ancient forests that cover the country, where the sheer density of nature seems to hide things that we cannot comprehend. This final story is perhaps the most unsettling of all, because it involves not just strange lights, but a direct, physical encounter and a terrifying loss of time. The man who experienced this, whom we will call Robert, was a family man who had recently inherited a large, vintage recreational vehicle from his late father. His father had spent years meticulously maintaining the vehicle, and it held a lot of sentimental value. To celebrate his inheritance and spend quality time with his family, Robert decided to take his wife, Rachel, and their 2 young children on a massive, cross-country road trip. They spent weeks driving through different states, enjoying the incredible scenery and visiting national parks. Eventually, they pulled into a highly rated campground situated in a deeply forested and mountainous region. Originally, they had only planned to stay for a single night, but on their first afternoon, Robert's son met another young boy at the camp's playground, and the two became instant friends. Seeing how happy his children were, Robert and Rachel decided to extend their stay for a few additional nights so the kids could play. The campground itself was incredibly vast. In the center of the property, there was a large developed communal area with a camp store, playground, and bathrooms where families could gather. But the actual campsites were scattered miles apart throughout a dense wilderness of towering pine trees, rocky meadows, and fast-flowing rivers. Robert chose a highly secluded spot on the outer edge of the campground, far away from any other campers, which was exactly how he preferred it. One of the reasons Robert insisted on such a secluded spot was because of a personal secret. He had a stubborn, lifelong habit of smoking cigarettes. His wife and children believed he had successfully quit smoking over a year ago, and because he did not want to disappoint them or expose his kids to the secondhand smoke, he had developed a strict routine of hiding it. Every single night, he would patiently wait in the dark RV until his wife and children were fast asleep. Once he was certain they were sleeping soundly, he would quietly slip out of the RV door with his lighter and a pack of cigarettes, heading into the woods to indulge his habit. Because the campground had a strict no-smoking policy in the communal areas, Robert would use his late-night cigarette breaks to take long walks into the surrounding wilderness. He had been a passionate hiker and camper his entire life, and despite his family constantly lecturing him about the dangers of hiking alone in the dark, he felt completely comfortable in the woods at night. He always carried a flashlight, kept a sharp eye on his surroundings, and never strayed too far from the main path. By their second night at the site, Robert had mapped out a perfect route. He had discovered a beautiful rocky ledge that overlooked a massive valley of dense treetops that stretched out as far as the eye could see. On his first visit to the ledge, he had sat on the rocks for over an hour, enjoying the absolute peace and meditating under the stars. It quickly became his designated smoking spot. The walk from the RV to the ledge took about 15 minutes along a narrow, winding dirt trail, which was the perfect distance to clear his head. On their third night at the campground, Robert waited for the clock to strike midnight before sneaking out. He quietly made his way down the familiar trail, reached the rocky ledge, sat down, and lit his cigarette. As he sat there in the silence, watching the smoke drift into the cool night air, he suddenly heard a highly unusual sound echoing from the woods behind him. At first, he tried to dismiss it, thinking his mind was just playing tricks on him in the darkness. But the sound persisted. It was a rhythmic, pulsating noise that sounded incredibly artificial. It was a distinct, repeating vibration, almost like someone making a deep, rolling sound with their mouth over and over again. It had a strange, metallic quality to it, and Robert knew with absolute certainty that it was not a sound made by any bird, mammal, or insect native to the North American wilderness. Unable to control his curiosity, Robert stood up from the ledge and began to walk slowly back into the trees, following the direction of the strange noise. He walked deeper into the thick brush, keeping his flashlight pointed toward the ground so he would not trip over exposed tree roots. The pulsating sound grew steadily louder as he advanced, vibrating in his chest. It felt as if he was closing in on the source, and he expected to find a piece of lost machinery, or perhaps another camper playing a joke. But just as he felt he was only feet away from whatever was making the noise, the sound abruptly cut off. Instantly, a heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the entire forest. Robert stopped in his tracks. He noticed that every single natural sound had vanished. The wind that had been rustling through the pine needles completely died down. The crickets and nocturnal bugs that had been singing loudly just seconds before were suddenly mute. The silence was so absolute that he could hear the sound of his own heartbeat racing in his ears. It was as if the entire forest had suddenly been placed on mute. As he stood frozen in the pitch-black woods, he heard the faint, distinct sound of a branch snapping directly behind him. Robert spun around, shining his flashlight into the darkness. Standing approximately 10 feet away from him, partially obscured by the thick trunk of a pine tree, was a figure. Robert gasped, his muscles locking up in pure terror. In the beam of his flashlight, he could see that the figure was standing on 2 legs, but it was unlike any human he had ever seen. It was incredibly tall and skinny, easily measuring over 7 feet in height. Its limbs were unnaturally long and thin, and its body was held in a strange, hunched-over posture. Robert stood completely paralyzed, his mind screaming at him to run, but his legs refused to move. He squinted through the darkness, trying to make out the details of its face. The creature seemed to be covered in a dark, hairless skin that absorbed the light, but as he adjusted the angle of his flashlight, he saw 2 large glassy eyes that reflected the pale moonlight like the eyes of a nocturnal predator. They stood in a tense, silent standoff for what felt like several minutes. Neither Robert nor the creature made a single movement. Gathering a small amount of courage, Robert took a tiny, cautious step forward to get a better look. The moment his foot touched the ground, the tall figure flinched violently. It shifted its weight, dropping even lower into a crouched, aggressive stance, as if it was preparing to charge directly at him. Robert froze again, his breath catching in his throat. He realized that the creature was highly sensitive to his movements, and he feared that if he tried to run, it would easily overtake him. He slowly began to shift his weight backward, preparing to retreat, but the creature seemed to sense his intention. It let out a bizarre, low-pitched clicking sound that vibrated through the air, and then, with terrifying speed, it skittered sideways into the deep brush, disappearing into the dark forest within a fraction of a second. The sheer speed of its movement startled Robert so badly that he lost his footing and fell backward onto the damp pine needles. He scrambled to his feet, shining his flashlight frantically in every direction, but the woods were completely empty. There was no sound of rustling leaves, no snapping branches, and no sign of the towering figure. He stood there for a few moments, trying to process the absolute impossibility of what he had just witnessed. Slowly, the natural sounds of the forest began to return. He could hear the wind blowing through the trees again, and the crickets resumed their nightly song, as if a barrier of silence had been lifted. Terrified that the creature might return, Robert turned and ran as fast as he could back down the trail toward his RV. When he finally burst through the door of the RV, he expected his wife to be fast asleep. Instead, Rachel was sitting at the small dining table, looking absolutely furious. Before he could even speak, she began lecturing him, demanding to know where he had been and why he had left her alone with the kids for so many hours. Robert was completely confused. He looked at his watch, expecting it to be around 1 o'clock in the morning. To his absolute horror, the digital clock on the microwave read 4:30 in the morning. He had lost over 3 hours of time that he could not account for. To him, the entire encounter in the woods, from the moment he heard the pulsating sound to the moment the creature ran away, had felt like it lasted no more than 20 minutes. He had no memory of what had happened during those missing hours. He sat down and told his wife the entire truth about his smoking habit and the terrifying figure he had encountered. Seeing the genuine terror in his eyes, Rachel's anger quickly turned to fear. They spent the rest of the night sitting in the locked RV, staring out the windows. Just as the sky was beginning to turn gray with the first light of dawn, Robert heard a massive, powerful whoosh sound directly above the roof of the RV. It was not the sound of wind. It felt as if a massive, heavy object had flown silently and incredibly close over the top of their vehicle. They packed up their campsite at sunrise and left the campground immediately, never to return. For years, Robert kept this experience to himself, fearing that people would think he was losing his mind. But after seeing others share similar encounters, he finally felt the courage to tell his story, knowing that there are things in the deep woods that science cannot explain. When we look at these 3 distinct experiences, we can begin to see a pattern that is as fascinating as it is deeply disturbing. In the first case, we have a young couple terrorized by unexplained horn sounds, flashing lights, and swaying figures, followed by locked doors mysteriously bursting open. In the second, a man and his dog are forced to witness glowing, merging spheres of light that hum with the energy of a fluorescent bulb and perform erratic maneuvers across his yard. And finally, a father in the woods experiences the classic phenomenon of the silent zone, an encounter with a towering 7-foot-tall entity, and a terrifying loss of over 3 hours of his life. In every single one of these accounts, the witnesses were completely ordinary people who had absolutely no reason to invent such bizarre tales. They were skeptics who lived normal, quiet lives before these incidents shattered their understanding of reality. Each story features a sudden and unexplainable failure of technology, whether it was cell service completely dropping out, a lack of physical evidence left behind in the mud, or a massive gap in memory and time. These are not the typical ghost stories or urban legends that we are used to hearing. They are raw, first-hand accounts of moments when the fabric of our everyday world seemed to peel back, revealing something completely foreign and indifferent to human understanding. For the people who live through these nights, the fear never truly goes away. They are left to live their lives in a world that looks exactly the same, but with the haunting knowledge that just beyond the tree line, or just beneath the surface of the dark water, lies an entirely different reality, waiting to show itself when we least expect it. They are left with unanswered questions, skeptical friends, and the quiet, heavy knowledge that we are far from being the only intelligent forces in this world. They realize that despite all of our modern advancements, maps, and communication networks, there are vast pockets of wilderness and dark horizons where we are completely vulnerable. We walk through life assuming we are the dominant presence, but these experiences suggest otherwise. Perhaps the most disturbing part of all is the realization that these events did not happen in ancient history or in distant mythical lands. They happened recently to normal people, right in our own backyards, lakeside camps, and designated campgrounds. It leaves us to wonder what we might encounter the next time we decide to take a late-night walk, or stay in a secluded home, or look out across a dark, silent lake. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And and remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. Back when I was 23 years old, I lived in a small studio apartment in Chicago. It was right after I finished college, and to be honest, I was completely broke. The apartment was nothing special, just a single, drafty room on the top floor of a 3-story building, but the rent was cheap and it was close to my work, which was all that really mattered to me. I had student loans piling up and no savings, so I did not have the luxury of being picky. The space was clean, functional, and most importantly, it was mine. The only window in the entire place looked out over a very narrow, dark alley. Across the way was another apartment building that looked almost identical to mine. The alley between the two buildings was incredibly tight, barely wide enough for a single car to squeeze through, and during the day, it got almost no sunlight. At night, it was absolutely pitch black. At the time, that did not really bother me much. I was working very late nights, bartending at a busy lounge on the north side of the city. I usually got home around 2:30 or 3 in the morning, meaning the city was completely quiet by the time I walked up my stairs. Once I got inside, I would kick off my shoes, turn on the overhead lights, make a quick meal, and zone out on my phone until I finally fell asleep. It was a simple, repetitive routine, and for the first month, nothing felt out of the ordinary. But then one night, everything changed. I had just walked in, turned on the overhead light, and was walking toward my kitchen counter when I thought I saw a quick flash of movement in the window directly across the alley. It was just a flicker, like a curtain twitching. I froze for a second, staring hard through the glass. But when I looked again, there was nothing. The window was dark and completely still. I shrugged it off, thinking that maybe I had just startled a neighbor who happened to be looking out their window, or maybe it was just a draft in their old building. The next night, it happened again. The moment I flipped my lights on, I saw the curtain shift in that same window. This time, I was absolutely sure of what I saw. I saw a human hand pull the curtain back just slightly before letting it fall back into place. I could not see the person behind it because the lights in that apartment were completely off. It was just a sliver of movement in an otherwise black void. But the reason this really caught my attention and made my stomach drop was because I had never once seen the lights on in that apartment. I had always assumed that nobody lived there. That night, I did not sleep well at all. Over the next week, I started paying much closer attention to that window. Every single night, without fail, the curtain would move within seconds of me turning on my lights. It was subtle but unmistakable. It was the exact same sequence of events. There was a slow parting in the curtain, a brief glimpse of the dark space beyond it, and then the curtain would close again. I began testing it to see if it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Some nights I would leave my lights completely off and sit silently on my couch near the window, peering out into the darkness. When I did this, absolutely nothing happened. The window across the alley remained completely still, but the very second I stood up and turned on even a tiny dim light, the curtain across the alley would immediately shift. Someone was actively watching me. I tried to find a logical explanation, but the timing was too perfect to be a coincidence. I asked my landlord about the unit across the alley, and he told me it had been vacant for months. He even laughed and joked that I was being paranoid. I considered calling the police, but I felt like reporting someone possibly looking at me through a window in an empty apartment sounded ridiculous. There was no crime, just a terrifying feeling that grew worse every single night. Then one night, everything escalated. I came home around 4 in the morning after a very long shift. When I reached my door, I noticed a crumpled note stuck in the doorframe. I pulled it free and unfolded it. It simply said, "Hey," written in messy blue ink. My legs went weak. My mind immediately flashed to the empty apartment across the alley. I ran inside, locked the door, and looked across. The curtain was drawn, and there was no movement. I immediately called my friend Jamie. Panicking, she told me to come over right away. I grabbed a backpack, stuffed some essentials into it, and got out of there. The next day, I confronted the landlord again and demanded to see the vacant apartment. He hesitated, but eventually agreed to meet me there with the key. The place was thick with dust and completely empty, with bare walls and creaking floorboards. But in the back room facing my window, there was a single metal folding chair. It was positioned directly in front of the window. Whoever had been watching me had access to a locked, vacant apartment. The police were called, but nothing came of it. The realization that my paranoia was correct made me physically sick. I moved out that week. To this day, I have no idea who was watching me, how they got in, or how long it would have gone on if I had not found that note. I sometimes wonder if it was the landlord, but I doubt he would have left the chair there if he was the stalker. I still dream about that dark window, and sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, absolutely certain that someone is still watching me. But as terrifying as it is to realize you are being watched in a crowded city, it is a completely different kind of nightmare when it happens in the middle of nowhere. When I was 12 years old, my family moved to a very rural area in Oregon, miles from the nearest town. We lived on a large plot of land, surrounded by incredibly dense pine forest. It was quiet, peaceful, and completely isolating. The house itself was built in the 1940s and had the typical old house features like creaky floors, a dark, creepy attic, and a detached, run-down shed that sat about 30 feet from our back door. The shed was packed with old rusty tools and junk from the previous owner. My dad always kept saying he was going to clean it out, but he never did. For the most part, we stayed away from it. The first time I noticed something strange was on a quiet weeknight close to midnight. I was awake, reading a book with a flashlight under my covers, when I suddenly heard our dog, Max, barking uncontrollably outside. Max was a golden retriever, super friendly but very alert. When he barked like that, it meant something was wrong. I crept out of bed and peeked out the window. The motion sensor light by the back door was on, casting long shadows across the wet lawn. Max was facing the shed, barking into the darkness. I could not see anyone, but Max would not stop. I just watched him for a bit until he finally calmed down, and then I went back to bed. The next morning, we found deep boot prints pressed into the damp dirt between our house and the shed. My dad dismissed it, saying it was probably just a neighbor or a passing drifter, but I could not stop thinking about it. Over the next few weeks, Max barked at that shed multiple times. Every time we would look outside and find nothing, but the footprints would be back, and they always led directly to the shed, never away from it. One night, around 2 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of footsteps on the gravel path outside my bedroom window. I froze in my bed, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped for a moment and then resumed, moving toward the shed. I peeked through the blinds, and the light by the back door flickered on. For just a second, I saw a tall man standing next to the shed door. He was wearing a dirty gray coat, and his face was completely obscured by shadows. Then the light went out. My heart pounded against my ribs as I backed away from the window. I woke my parents, and my dad grabbed his rifle and ran outside, but the man was gone. The footprints were fresh though, leading right up to the shed. This time, my dad decided to check inside, but all he found were rusty tools and old tarps. He added a new padlock and reinforced the doors. For about a month, things were quiet. Then Max went missing. We searched everywhere through the thick woods, up and down the gravel roads, and even asked our distant neighbors, but he was gone. I was completely heartbroken, holding out hope that he was just lost. That night, I could not sleep at all. Around 3 in the morning, I heard our back door creak. I got out of bed and tiptoed into the hallway, finding my dad already up with his rifle. We moved to the back door just as the motion light flickered on. Standing by the shed was the man again. But this time, he was holding a knife in one hand and Max's collar in the other. I felt a horrible, weightless dread wash over me, making my knees buckle. My dad shouted and raised his rifle, but the man turned and sprinted into the dark woods. We called the police, and they searched the area, but they found no trace of him. What they did find inside our old shed, however, made me physically sick. The floor had been cleared of junk, and someone had carved disturbing symbols and crude images into the hard dirt. In the corner was a pile of animal bones. Even worse, behind a false panel in the shed wall, the officers found a backpack filled with stolen items, like wallets, watches, and worn clothing that belonged to multiple people. Inside was also a notebook filled with pages of strange symbols, incoherent rambling, and detailed drawings of our house and our family. It was a clear message that he had been watching us. We decided to leave immediately. While we were packing our things, I looked out my window one last time. Just beyond the police tape, about 10 feet into the tree line, I saw the man's face staring directly at me. I screamed for my dad, who ran outside and fired several rounds into the dark woods. We drove away a few days later, relocating to a much less remote area. We never found out who he was, but I will never forget that face in the trees. The move was incredibly fast and chaotic, but none of us cared about the hassle. We just wanted to be as far away from those woods as possible. We never got closure about what happened to Max, and the thought of those other wallets and watches in the backpack still haunts me. Now, some people believe that escaping deep into the wilderness is the perfect way to get away from the dangers of the world. But sometimes the woods hide things that are far more terrifying than anything you could ever find in a busy city. In the summer of 2018, my friends and I planned a weekend camping trip in the Blue Ridge Mountains. The group consisted of Abby, Marcus, his younger brother Tim, Tim's girlfriend Hannah, and me. We were all in our early 20s, fresh out of college, and extremely eager to unplug from our phones, our social media, and our busy lives. We picked a highly remote spot, deep in the national park, where the trees grew thick, the air smelled of pine and damp soil, and there was absolutely no cell signal for miles. The first night was completely normal. We hiked in with our heavy gear, found a beautiful, secluded clearing near a quiet lake with just enough space for our 3 tents, built a large campfire, and cooked hot dogs and marshmallows. We spent the night telling stories, drinking, and staying up late, looking at the stars. The silence of the forest was incredibly relaxing, and we felt completely safe. But during our second night, everything started to feel completely wrong. Around 11 at night, we were sitting around the fire when Marcus suddenly went stiff and pointed toward the woods, asking if we saw that. We all looked, but nothing was there in the darkness. He swore he saw a figure duck behind a tree trunk, maybe 40 yards away. Tim dismissed it as a deer, but 20 minutes later we heard a loud, sharp stick snap in that same direction. Abby got spooked and wanted to go to bed, so we decided to call it a night. We poured water on the fire, zipped up our tents, and tried to sleep. That night I woke up to a sound that made my blood run cold. It was the sound of heavy, raspy breathing coming from just outside my tent, not even 10 feet from my head. I froze, too terrified to make a sound. I thought it might be one of my friends, but the breathing sounded like an older person who smoked too much. The breathing slowly moved from one side of my tent to the other, and then it stopped. I lay there in the dark, barely breathing, until I finally fell back asleep. The next morning, I decided not to say anything to avoid ruining the trip, but at breakfast Marcus looked incredibly tense. He said someone had been standing outside his tent last night, walking around it multiple times. Tim then confessed that he had stepped out to use the restroom around 4 in the morning and thought he saw a dark figure crouching near our cold fire pit. We searched the area and found footprints circling all 3 tents. In a muddy patch of dirt, we found a very clear footprint of a bare human foot. The tracks led into the thick woods and vanished. This discovery made the atmosphere incredibly tense. We tried to convince ourselves it was just a local hiker, but deep down we knew something was very wrong. That night, we decided to build a much larger fire and keep our flashlights close. None of us wanted to go to sleep, so we stayed up, talking in quiet, nervous voices. Around 2 in the morning, we heard the distinct crunch of leaves, followed by a low, whispering voice. Marcus snapped on his flashlight, and for a split second, we saw a completely naked man crouching behind a tree. The moment the light hit him, he scrambled back into the trees like an animal. We were too terrified to go to our tents, but hiking out in the dark was too dangerous, so we stayed huddled by the fire. We held our flashlights like weapons, our eyes darting into the shadows. A few hours later, a voice drifted out from the pitch-black woods, saying, "I see you guys." It was a low, chilling whisper that made our skin crawl. A moment later, I felt my tent shift, and I watched in absolute horror as the metal zipper began to slowly slide downward. I screamed at the top of my lungs, causing my friends to start screaming too. The sudden noise scared whoever was outside, and we heard them sprint away into the darkness. We stayed awake until dawn, packed our things, and hiked back to the car. At the ranger station, the ranger told us they had reports of wild men living illegally in the forest who were known to steal and do far worse things. I will never go camping again. The drive home was incredibly silent, with none of us speaking for the first few hours. The shock of what we had experienced was too heavy to process, and every time the car stopped at a red light or a gas station, we all looked around nervously as if we were still being followed. We kept in touch over the next few weeks, but the bond we shared had changed. The easygoing, carefree friendship we had in college was replaced by a shared trauma that we couldn't easily talk about. Tim and Hannah actually broke up a few months later, and I always wondered if the stress of that night played a part in it. I spent months checking the locks on my windows and doors at home, unable to sleep without a light on in the hallway. Even now, whenever my friends talk about planning a trip to the mountains or going on a hike, I immediately make an excuse to back out. The image of that zipper slowly moving down in the dark is permanently burned into my mind, a reminder of just how close we came to a nightmare that we might not have survived. We were incredibly lucky that night, and I thank God every single day that we all made it out of those dark mountains alive. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Years ago, a well-known true crime researcher shared a video discussing some of the creepiest drawings ever made by children. Many of them seemed like typical childhood oddities, but a few stood out because they felt as though they had much darker, more sinister backstories. Drawings are often seen as just a way for children to express their wild imaginations, but sometimes they act as a literal window into an ongoing, real-life crime. Over the years, people from all over the world began sending in their own personal experiences, along with the drawings their siblings, children, or charges had made. Today we are going to dive into 3 of those stories. These are not just spooky tales, they are documented events where a simple piece of paper and crayon revealed a terrifying reality. Our first story takes us back to the summer of 2012. Tracy was 14 years old at the time, living in a quiet, friendly suburban neighborhood with her parents and her 6-year-old little brother. Like many teenagers during the summer break, Tracy was often tasked with helping out around the house, which included keeping an eye on her brother and occasionally tidying up his room. One afternoon, Tracy was doing just that. She was picking up toys, putting books back on the shelves, and organizing the general clutter. As she reached down to gather some stray items from under her brother's bed, her hand brushed against a piece of paper. She pulled it out, assuming it was just a discarded coloring page that she could throw in the recycling bin, but when she flipped it over, she stopped what she was doing. The paper was a drawing of their family. It was created with the typical skill level of a 6-year-old, using bright crayons to depict stick figures. At the center of the page was the family dinner table. Tracy could easily identify everyone. There was her mother, her father, Tracy herself, and her little brother. The boy had even gone out of his way to include highly detailed drawings of the family dog and the family cat sitting near the table. However, what caught Tracy's attention and made her skin crawl was a 5th person in the drawing. Sitting on the floor, tucked away in the corner directly behind the dinner table, was a figure dressed entirely in jet black clothing. The figure had reddish-brown, curly hair drawn with thick, deliberate crayon strokes. Every time Tracy looked at the dark figure, she felt as if those crudely drawn eyes were staring back at her, bringing an overwhelming sense of dread into the sunny bedroom. Tracy sat down on the edge of the bed and called her brother into the room. She held up the drawing and asked him who the man in black was. Her brother looked at the paper, but instead of answering, he shrugged his shoulders, looked down at his shoes, and said that he was not allowed to tell. Tracy tried to ask again, thinking it might be a game, but he refused to say another word. Feeling uneasy, Tracy decided to keep the drawing and show it to her parents that evening. When the family gathered for dinner, Tracy placed the drawing on the table and explained what her brother had said. The parents looked at it, and the father laughed it off. He figured the boy had just created an imaginary friend, or was playing a make-believe game. But when the mother gently asked the boy who the 5th person was, his entire demeanor changed. He crossed his arms, made a pouty face, and shrugged his shoulders. The only response they could get out of him was the exact same phrase, "I am not allowed to tell." No matter how much they nudged, he would not budge. But the problem was, things only got stranger from there. A few days later, the parents had to go out for a few hours, leaving Tracy in charge of watching her brother. As Tracy sat in the living room doing her homework, the house was mostly quiet. But then, she started to hear the faint sound of voices coming from her brother's bedroom down the hall. It sounded like a 2-way conversation. Tracy stood up, crept down the carpeted hallway, and quietly pushed his bedroom door open. Her brother was sitting on the floor, pushing his toy cars back and forth. He appeared to be talking to himself. Tracy walked in and asked if he was talking to anyone, but he just shrugged and ignored her. But as Tracy looked around the room, she noticed something highly unusual. Lying on the carpet near his toys were several pieces of green apple-flavored hard candy. Tracy held them up to the light, noting they were a cheap, generic brand you could only get at specific dollar stores or gas stations, which was highly alarming because their mother was incredibly strict about sweets and never bought this specific type of candy. Tracy asked her brother where he got the candy, but he went completely silent. When Tracy reached down to pick them up, her brother suddenly flew into a rage. He screamed at her, demanding that she give them back immediately. When their parents returned home, Tracy handed them the candy and explained what had happened. Because it was the middle of the summer break, there was no way he could have gotten the candy from school or friends. The parents grew deeply concerned. They questioned the boy, but he stubbornly refused to speak. At this point, the father decided to ground him, telling him he had to stay in his room until he decided to tell the truth. To make sure no one was secretly entering the house, the parents searched every corner. They checked the closets, looked under the bed, and even searched the hallway storage spaces. They checked the basement stairs and the window locks, but they overlooked the fact that the little boy's window did not have a secure latch. That night, Tracy could not sleep. She had a terrible feeling that something was deeply wrong. Instead of lying in her bed, she dragged a pillow to the floor and sat right next to her bedroom door, which was directly adjacent to her brother's room. She knew that if her brother started talking again, she would easily hear it through the thin walls. Sure enough, way past her brother's bedtime, she heard the quiet sound of whispering. Tracy did not hesitate. She jumped up, ran down the hallway, and flung his bedroom door open. What she saw made her heart drop into her stomach. Her 6-year-old brother was standing right in front of his wide-open window. On the other side of the screen, a grown man was holding onto the window frame, preparing to climb directly into the room. Tracy let out a blood-curdling scream for her parents. The moment the man saw Tracy and heard her scream, he let go of the window frame, dropped to the ground, and fled into the dark night on a bicycle. Her brother burst into tears, terrified by the sudden chaos. The parents rushed in, and the police were called immediately. With officers in the house, the little boy finally realized the danger he was in and began to talk. He explained that his new friend had told him never to tell anyone about him, otherwise they would not be allowed to play anymore. He said they had met a few weeks earlier in front of the house. The man had stopped on his bicycle, offered him candy, and promised to bring more if they could hang out. The young boy, trusting the stranger, had pointed out his bedroom window and told him how to get there. It was a chilling realization of just how close the family had come to an absolute tragedy, all foreshadowed by a simple crayon drawing. And so, while that situation was resolved before anyone was hurt, it shows how easily a child's innocent drawing can hold a terrifying truth. But sometimes the threat is not outside the window, but right inside the room. It was the kind of fear that ruins a family's sense of safety, transforming their peaceful home into a place of constant vigilance. Fast forward to 2015, when a mother of 2 children, a 6-year-old boy and an 8-year-old girl, shared a deeply disturbing experience. For weeks, a bizarre and exhausting routine had taken over their household. Every single night, somewhere between midnight and 5 in the morning, the mother would wake up to the sound of her bedroom door creaking open. There, standing in the doorway, would be her 6-year-old son, crying and shaking with fear. The clock on her nightstand would read 3 in the morning, and the cold draft from the air conditioning made the quiet house feel even more ominous. The mother would lie awake for hours after putting him back to sleep, listening to every creak and groan of the old house, wondering if she was losing her mind. He claimed that every night, a terrifying figure would emerge from his bedroom closet. It would slowly walk across the room and stop at the exact same spot at the foot of his bed, where it would just stand and stare at him in the darkness. In the beginning, the parents did what any normal parents would do. They walked him back to his room, turned on the lights, and searched the closet to prove to him that nothing was there. but there was one detail that kept bothering them. Every time they went into his room, the closet door was wide open, even though they always made sure to shut it tightly before he went to sleep. When they asked the boy why the closet door was open, he cried and said it was because the thing had opened it to come out. Meanwhile, his 8-year-old sister slept soundly in the next room, completely oblivious,